Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head? It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. A face that looks innocent and a body that can't seem to stay still. That was Robert Lemming. At first glance he appeared harmless, but once you dive into the full context behind that interview you'll quickly realize he's anything but innocent. In May of 2019 his live-in partner and her young child vanished without a trace for weeks while Robert was out giving interviews. Investigators were working tirelessly to uncover the truth, and what they discovered next will make you question everything you thought you knew. The horrifying details were so chilling and brutal that the case earned him the nickname Canada's Chris Watts. And by the end of this video you'll understand exactly why. To really dive into the story, let's rewind to 2017. That's when Jasmine Lovett and Robbie Anderson welcomed their first baby, a daughter named Aaliyah Sanderson. At the time Jasmine and Robbie weren't married and they were both pretty young. Jasmine was in her early 20s and by all accounts she was a strikingly beautiful woman, but as with many relationships things weren't as perfect as they may have seemed on the outside. After Aaliyah was born, cracks started to show in Jasmine and Roy's relationship. According to reports, Robbie began coming home later and later, leaving Jasmine alone with their newborn. Then things took a turn for the worse when he started showing up drunk or high. That behavior only escalated and soon Robbie was becoming more aggressive. One day Robbie came home and things quickly escalated when he aggressively demanded money from Jasmine. She was terrified for her safety and ran into the bathroom to call the police. By the time the police arrived, Robbie was gone. And since Jasmine hadn't been physically harmed, they told her there wasn't much they could do at that point. However, Jasmine managed to get an emergency protection order against Robbie, but just 13 days later the order was revoked. After Jasmine and Robbie claimed they had worked things out, they told authorities they didn't need the order anymore. Though the details of what happened between them during that time remain unclear, but what we do know for sure is that Jasmine and Roy eventually split up and Jasmine got custody of Aaliyah. After the breakup, Jasmine and Roy managed to keep things relatively civil. They focused on co-parenting and tried their best to maintain a peaceful environment for their daughter. Despite the challenges of their past, keep in mind that this all took place in 2018, and during all the emotional turmoil Jasmine found solace in her family, whom she was very close to. Reports mentioned that Jasmine was especially close to her mom and sister. They often gathered for family dinners and she kept them updated on everything happening in her life. After months of navigating heartbreak, Jasmine decided it was time to start putting herself out there again, so she joined a few dating sites in hopes of meeting someone new, and it wasn't long before Jasmine met Robert Lemming, a man who seemed to meet her high standards. At the time they met, Robert was 34 years old, about 10 years older than Jasmine, who was in her mid-20s. While the age gap wasn't huge, it was still noticeable. Robert was originally from the United Kingdom but had moved around a lot as a child due to his father's military career. This constant moving made it hard for him to form lasting friendships, an issue that continued into his adult life. Despite his struggles with socializing, Robert found a way to connect with others online where he felt more comfortable. He loved chatting in online forums and meeting people without the pressure of face-to-face interaction. It was actually in one of these chat rooms that he met his first wife, a Canadian woman who was studying to become a teacher. They married in 2013 and Robert moved to Canada to be with her. They had a son together, but unfortunately the marriage didn't last, and by 2017 they had separated. Robert's ex-wife received full custody of their son, with Robert only having supervised visitation. Although Robert and his ex-wife were no longer together, he stayed in Canada thanks to his permanent residency status, which he had earned through his job as a heavy goods vehicle mechanic. After his marriage ended, Robert, like Jasmine, Turned to dating sites where he dated several women before finally meeting Jasmine. Now their whirlwind relationship began in September of 2018, and just a month later Jasmine and her young daughter Aaliyah were moving into Robert's home. It was a bold step, one that raised eyebrows, especially with a child in the mix. Moving in after only 1 month of dating is fast by most standards, but for them it seemed like the logical choice at the time. Financially it made sense. Sharing a home meant cutting costs in half, something many people can appreciate in today's economy. Unlike a roommate setup, living with a partner offers more than just a practical split of rent. There's someone to help with groceries, chores, and in Jasmine's case, childcare. With no job at the time, Jasmine relied on child support from her ex while dedicating herself to raising Aaliyah. Having Robert step in to help with Aaliyah must have been a welcome relief, and help he did. Robert was more than eager to pitch in, whether it was cooking, cleaning, or watching Aaliyah while Jasmine ran errands. He seemed to embrace his new role wholeheartedly. His love for Aaliyah was obvious. He treated her like his own, and for Jasmine that made all the difference. From the outside things looked perfect. Jasmine's family thought so too. She remained close to her mother and sister John hubby, frequently meeting them for family dinners. When Robert began joining these gatherings, her family welcomed him. He seemed kind, attentive, and genuinely invested in Jasmine and Aaliyah, but not everyone was entirely on board. John hubby, always protective of her sister, couldn't shake her unease. The relationship was moving too fast for her liking, and while Robert's care for Aaliyah and Jasmine was clear, John hubby couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came April 14, 2019, a family dinner like any other. Jasmine, Robert, and Aaliyah joined the usual gathering, but this time something was off. John hubby couldn't help but notice that Jasmine and Robert seemed distant, a little more reserved than usual. It was subtle, but enough to make her wonder. Still, the dinner ended without incident, and the sisters even made plans to meet again on Good Friday, April 19, but when the day came, Jasmine never showed up. No call, no text, nothing. This was completely out of character. Jasmine was someone who always kept her commitments, especially with family. John hubby's worry grew with every unanswered call and text. She even tried messaging Jasmine on Facebook, but her messages weren't just ignored, they were marked undelivered. Unable to shake her concern, John hubby drove to Jasmine and Robert's house that evening around 5:00 p.m. The basement light was on, a sign that someone had to be home. She knocked on the door, no answer. She rang the doorbell. Still nothing. She waited, knocked again, and even tried peeking inside, but the house remained eerily silent. With no way to reach her sister, John hubby left, hoping she was overthinking things. 2 days later, on April 21, Jasmine's mother Kim decided to visit the house herself. Like John hubby, she was met with silence, knocking, ringing the doorbell. It was all futile, but as she prepared to leave, Kim noticed something strange near the front door. 2 pairs of sneakers. One pair was freshly cleaned, still soaking wet, and placed neatly by the entrance. Though her mother hadn't received any response, she left a note on the front door of Jasmine and Robert's home. It was probably a message urging them to get in touch, hoping that either Jasmine or Robert would finally respond. But the days went by and still there was no word from Jasmine. By April 23, 4 days after leaving the note, the family's concern had reached a boiling point. Jasmine had missed several planned check-ins, and on this day she was supposed to meet her mother and sister for another family dinner. This dinner was a long-standing tradition for the family, and missing it was something Jasmine would never do. Despite the growing worry, the family still clung to a small thread of hope. Maybe something had come up, or maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as the hours ticked by and Jasmine didn't show up, that hope began to fade. This was the moment that everything shifted for John hubby. She was beyond worried. The feeling that something was terribly wrong weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. So she decided to go to the police station and file a missing persons report, and she was determined to do whatever she could to help find her sister. She handed over her phone, answered every question the police had, and provided a full account of everything she knew about Jasmine's life in recent months. Initially, detectives considered the possibility that Jasmine had left voluntarily. However, John hubby immediately dismissed the idea. Her sister would never abandon her family. especially not without contacting someone, least of all with her young daughter Aaliyah left behind. Jasmine was deeply devoted to her child, and her family disappearing without a trace simply wasn't in her character. Investigators also turned their attention to Jasmine's ex Robbie, wondering if he might be connected to her disappearance. John Hubby clarified that while Robbie was no longer involved in Jasmine's life, he had relinquished his parental rights to Aaliyah, which meant he was no longer obligated to pay child support. While this had added financial strain on Jasmine, there had been no indications of lingering conflict between them. After investigating further, police ruled him out as a suspect. However, when the detectives began looking deeper into Jasmine's relationship with her current partner Robert, they found themselves uncovering a much more complicated situation than they had initially imagined. So back in December of 2018, Jasmine had confided in her sister John Hubby about the troubles she was facing with Robert. Their relationship was strained and they had actually broken up. However, they decided to continue living under the same roof as roommates. It was an unusual arrangement, especially considering there's a toddler in the house, but Jasmine explained it as a practical decision. Moving out with a toddler is not only difficult but also costly. She justified it as a temporary solution, hoping they could figure things out. And just a few weeks later, Jasmine told John Hubby that they had reconciled and decided to give their relationship another shot. However, the troubles didn't end there. Jasmine revealed another personal detail to her sister that added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. During their period of separation, she had become pregnant, but instead of continuing with the pregnancy, Jasmine made the difficult decision to terminate. At the emotional weight of that choice seemed to linger, and it was unclear whether it played a role in the breakup, their reconciliation, or in something deeper that was affecting their relationship. As time went on, financial stress began to build. With Robbie no longer providing child support for Aaliyah, Jasmine found herself carrying the full burden of providing for both herself and her daughter. While she hadn't yet secured a job, she was determined to find work. In fact, Jasmine longed to return to the workforce, not just for financial reasons but also to feel productive and to have more interaction with other adults. She even admitted to feeling jealous when Robert left for work each day while she stayed behind to care for Aaliyah. Now, John Hubby's account convinced detectives that this was no runaway case. Something else had happened to Jasmine, and the police wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. Within days, they pieced together a timeline of events leading up to her disappearance. As mentioned earlier, Jasmine and her daughter Aaliyah were last seen at a family dinner on April 14th, and everything seemed perfectly normal. On April 15th, CCTV footage captured them at a local grocery store. Jasmine appeared calm and collected as she paid for her groceries at a self-checkout, with Aaliyah peacefully nestled in her stroller. The following day, April 16th, was when the first hint of something troubling began to unfold. Robert dropped Aaliyah off at daycare at precisely 7:12 in the morning. Everything appeared fine as usual, but things took a strange twist later in the day. At 4:46 p.m. Robert returned to pick up Aaliyah, but there was a problem. He wasn't on the authorized pickup list. This wasn't a small detail. In order to take Aaliyah home, Robert had to call Jasmine, who then had to personally authorize the daycare staff to release Aaliyah into his care. Now, while this was certainly unusual, it wasn't the most alarming part. What happened after that was Jasmine and Aaliyah would never be seen or heard from again. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Days went by without a trace. Then on April 18th, an odd clue surfaced. Jasmine's credit card was used to place a food delivery order, but the authorities couldn't confirm whether Jasmine herself had placed the order or if someone else had gained access to her card. But it was clear that whoever had used it was still connected to her in some way. By now, the focus of the investigation had shifted to Robert. After all, he had been the last person seen with both Jasmine and Aaliyah. Genevieve, Jasmine's sister, had already told the authorities about the tension in Jasmine and Robert's relationship, their breakup, their reconciliation, and the strain they were under. This information made Robert an even more important person of interest. It seemed fair to question him, especially considering all the recent turmoil in their relationship, so on April 24 the police decided it was time for a welfare check at Robert's home. What happened next was strange and unsettling. The officers knocked on the door but no one answered. They knocked again and again. It was like a game of Groundhog Day, repeated knocks but still no response. Then the officers noticed something strange. The note that Jasmine's mother had left on the door just days earlier was still there. It was almost as if it had been waiting for them, but that wasn't the only odd detail. The front door's window, which had previously been clear, was now covered with something that looked like cellophane, the kind of clear plastic used to wrap gifts. It was the only window on the door that was covered, and it completely obstructed the view into the house. This made it impossible to see what was happening inside. The officers kept knocking, rang the doorbell, and waited. The atmosphere was tense, like something was being hidden. While waiting, one officer noticed a wet trunk liner lying over the air conditioner, seemingly drying out. It was obvious the trunk liner had been recently cleaned. In addition, the garden hose had been unwound, which suggested it had been used to rinse something down, likely the trunk liner. This observation immediately brought to mind the sneakers Jasmine's mother had seen earlier, which had been soaked and washed. A lot of signs were pointing to a cleanup, but what was being hidden? Then, as they continued to observe, they realized something. This house hadn't been abandoned. Someone had been there cleaning and moving things around. The only problem was that the police couldn't get inside just for a welfare check. The locked door and the covered windows left them with no easy way in. The officers weren't ready to give up. They decided to get creative and called the fire department. With the help of a ladder truck, they managed to peer into the windows of the upper floors, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that could give them more information. Unfortunately, they saw nothing through the windows, but as soon as the fire truck arrived, the lights inside the house flickered on, and moments later Robert opened the front door. Of course, the officers questioned him, and his response, "Well, take a look at this. Have we been here for hours and hours and hours now? Hey, banging on your door? Well, that's the reason that we're here. The family's calling us saying we haven't heard from our daughter and our sister." Okay, that makes sense. Okay, why does that make sense? At this point, the officers knew they needed to dig deeper. They asked Robert about Jasmine's car, and he explained that she didn't drive. That seemed odd considering she was a grown adult and should have some means of transportation. They also noticed the note on the door that Jasmine's mother had left behind, but Robert claimed he had no idea about it. The situation was becoming more bizarre with each passing moment. The officers were growing increasingly suspicious of Robert's behavior. His responses were erratic and his story didn't seem to add up. As they pressed him for more details, it felt like Robert was either hiding something important or just completely out of touch with reality. So, determined to get to the bottom of things, the officers decided to take a closer look at Robert's past. As it turns out, Robert had a record of emotional abuse in his previous relationship. His ex-wife had reported that he would gaslight her, call her crazy, and emotionally mistreat her. It seemed that Robert's neglect and verbal mistreatment were a big part of what led to their divorce, but it didn't stop there. His ex-wife also reported that Robert had a growing collection of guns and knives, which alarmed her to the point that she feared for her safety and the safety of their child. The officers dug even further into Robert's history and found that his ex had also reported him for animal mistreatment. Apparently, Robert had taken the dog they once owned together to a park, tied it to a tree without food or water, and left it there. Thankfully, someone at the park noticed the dog and brought it to the Humane Society. Now, this was a huge red flag. Anyone who is cruel to an animal is likely to become cruel to humans too, and Robert's actions toward animals raised serious concerns. He was charged with animal abuse and plead guilty to 3 charges: causing an animal to be in distress, failing to provide an animal with food and water, and failing to provide an animal with shelter. While he didn't serve jail time, he was slapped with a hefty fine of $5,000 and was banned from owning animals for 10 years. But Robert's troubling history doesn't stop there. During the divorce hearings, Robert's ex-wife uncovered some seriously disturbing stuff. She found some chilling internet searches on Robert's phone. One was about chaining a dog to a tree, which, considering his history, definitely set off alarm bells. But the next search, it was even worse. It was about a mother and child dying in a house fire. Just imagine how terrified His ex must have felt after what he'd already done to that dog she couldn't help but fear that he might do something much worse to her and her son. With all this terrifying new info about Robert's past, the police decided it was time to get serious. On April 25, they arrested him in connection with the disappearances of Jasmine and Aaliyah, and brought him in for a formal interrogation. When asked about the last time he saw Jasmine and Aaliyah, Robert said that on April 17 they had gone on a picnic at Bragg Creek, about 30 minutes from his home. Afterward they all returned to the house. According to Robert, Jasmine sat on the couch watching TV while he got ready for a date. Keep in mind, Robert had been telling people that he and Jasmine were just roommates at this point, and he even claimed he'd been seeing another woman for quite some time. Robert went on to say everything seemed perfectly fine with Jasmine before he left for his date, but when he came back that night, Jasmine and Aaliyah were nowhere to be found. This raised some serious red flags for the investigators, especially since Jasmine's family had told them that Robert and Jasmine were in a serious relationship. After their breakup, the officers decided to reach out to the woman Robert said he was dating that night. A woman we'll call Kate. When they spoke with her, Kate confirmed she had indeed been with Robert on the night Jasmine and Aaliyah disappeared. The police dug deeper, asking Kate some follow-up questions. She revealed that she Robert had met online in February of 2019, roughly 5 months after Jasmine and Aaliyah had moved in with him. They'd gone on some dates, and Robert occasionally stayed at Kate's house. It didn't seem like he was trying to hide the relationship, but here's the kicker. Kate told the police she had never been to Robert's place. Every time she asked why, he claimed his room was messy and that he had a roommate. He even referred to Jasmine as his tenant, not his girlfriend. But as strange as all of this was, the police couldn't just jump to conclusions. Even though they were suspicious, they didn't have enough to tie him directly to Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. So Robert was released, but not without a few conditions. His car and phone were seized, and they obtained a search warrant for his townhouse. They told him he couldn't go home until they were done investigating. Over the next few days, the police combed through everything. They looked into Robert's phone data and uncovered that on April 23, the day Jasmine and Aaliyah were reported missing, Robert had deleted around 30 photos of the two of them. He'd also deleted some photos of a gun, and to make matters worse, his phone's location data showed he had been in the Bragg Creek area at the time Jasmine and Aaliyah went missing. Remember, he had claimed they went there for a picnic, but the timing was very suspicious, so the police decided they needed to check out this creek area. When they searched it, they discovered a makeshift fire pit that looked freshly used, but not for cooking hot dogs or s'mores. As they examined the area, they found some truly disturbing items: a car seat belt, toddler shoes, diapers, parts of children's books, and a Jungle Book DVD. Scent dogs were brought in, and they alerted to the presence of an accelerant used to start the fire. The investigation didn't stop there. CCTV footage from a local gas station showed Robert filling up his car and a gas can, followed by him going through a car wash. But it was what they found when they searched his home that was even stranger. The front door had been barricaded with 2 long poles, and as mentioned earlier, the window was covered in cellophane. Multiple spots on the walls had also been sanded down and cleaned. Inside they found more oddities: a plastic hammer filled with sand and boxes of blue moving blankets. They also found a gun safe packed with multiple guns and boxes of ammo. But what stood out most was a partially melted firearm part, infant toys, Jasmine's prescription bottles, and even her shredded passport in his trash can. But wait, there was something even stranger. They found raw strips of bacon scattered all over the house, thrown about like it was some sort of bizarre breadcrumb trail. One piece of raw bacon was found draped over a dining room chair, another in the garage, and yet another in the room with the furnace. As if that wasn't strange enough, an empty bacon package was sitting idly in the kitchen. But despite all the bizarre findings, there was still no sign of Jasmine or Aaliyah. Now, while all of this was unfolding, Robert himself was out there giving interviews, adamantly claiming that he had nothing to do with Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide. I still am. Or what are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head? It's very stressful, but I hope they will be Found, and I hope we can move forward from this. No, we were friends, absolutely friends, and supporting each other. I would like obviously for them to be found and for me to be clear of this your relationship with Jasmine. Good. I mean, were you a boyfriend, girlfriend, or good friends? Nothing along to me until of course I got arrested. So what happens with you right now? I'm just going to wait until I get a phone call to say that I can go. How are you feeling throughout all of this? Traumatized, of course. Is there anything else that you want to add to all this? Yet if anyone sees her or Aaliyah, Jasmine or Aaliyah, please let the authorities know. They said that they would be done with the property today and that I'll be able to go back to the property. So you're hoping to sleep there tonight? I hope to sleep there tonight, yes. As you might have seen in the video, Robert appeared to be high or possibly intoxicated. According to him, that had been his life for the past few days. He claimed everyone thought he was a kidnapper or murderer, and as a result he had lost his job. His friends had turned on him and he had nothing to do but drink every day. He also complained bitterly about the police, saying they had destroyed his house and made a huge mess. Robert insisted that he was innocent and hired a lawyer, convinced that he needed help to prove it. But then someone close to him came forward anonymously, revealing that Robert had a reputation for being a loose cannon and behaving erratically. Investigators believed this new information as it fit the pattern of strange interactions they'd already had with him. It was yet another piece of the puzzle that made him look increasingly suspicious. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to press charges, so the police decided to try a new strategy. On May 5th, 2 undercover officers approached Robert on the street near his home. Remember, Robert had been talking a lot about how his life was falling apart, how he had lost his job, his friends, and had no one to turn to. It seemed like this was exactly what the police were hoping for, because as soon as the officers started talking to him, Robert began to open up. The undercover officers kept complimenting him and boosting his ego, telling him they believed he was innocent. This flattery seemed to have an impact on Robert, making him more willing to talk to them. At one point during their conversation, the officers even told Robert a false story. They claimed that while the police were investigating his house, one of his neighbors had stolen evidence from the scene and given it to them. This wasn't true at all, but they hoped it would make Robert trust them more. They kept manipulating him by suggesting that he meet them for a beer where they could talk about destroying the evidence together. Robert, clearly feeling lonely and vulnerable, agreed to meet up with them, but even though he seemed to be opening up, he was still a bit suspicious of the officers. He even asked them multiple times if they were really cops or if they were just trying to trick him. The undercover officers reassured him each time, convincing him that they weren't law enforcement. The officers continued their act, telling Robert crazy stories about how they were part of a criminal group, a gang with a lot of experience in illegal activities. They painted a picture of how bad the police were and how much they could help Robert. They even gave him advice on how to stop the cops from suspecting him, all while playing into his insecurities and fears. Eventually, the officers invited Robert to their so-called warehouse, which they made sound like some kind of secret hideout where they kept all their illegal weapons. Robert, desperate for someone to talk to and willing to take any support he could get, agreed to go with them. When they arrived at the warehouse, the officers showed him a collection of guns, hoping to make Robert believe that they were dangerous criminals. Seeing the weapons seemed to trigger something in Robert. He began to feel like he could trust these people who had been feeding him all these stories, so he started opening up more. He told them that when he and Jasmine were dating, he had cheated on her. He justified it by saying every single guy does that. But while this is clearly not true for everyone, it gave the officers even more insight into his mindset and character. According to Robert, Jasmine had wanted to get married, but he didn't, and this caused a lot of tension between them. As the conversation continued, Robert opened up even more. Despite only meeting these two officers 5 hours earlier, he confessed in detail, almost as if he was seeking validation or sympathy. He didn't clearly explain how he had killed Jasmine or her daughter Aaliyah, but he did share disturbing details. After killing them, Robert used his phone to find a remote area to dispose of their bodies. He chose Bragg Creek and drove there to check out the surroundings. He said he waited until the next day to hide the bodies, taking them to the woods near Bragg Creek. Once there, he buried them and drenched them in gasoline. Although he didn't burn their bodies. His hope was that the smell of gasoline would confuse the cadaver dogs and prevent them from finding the remains. Robert's efforts to cover his tracks didn't stop there. He told the officers that he had also set up a makeshift fire pit to burn Jasmine and Aaliyah's personal belongings. Items like Aaliyah's car seat and other possessions were burned, all to make it look like Jasmine had simply taken her child and run away. Robert even went to the extent of covering the bodies in mulch because he believed the mulch would help mask the scent and confuse the cadaver dogs. Further, what struck the officers most was Robert's obsession with throwing off the cadaver dogs. He had bacon all over his house, and it wasn't just because he liked the smell of the meat. Robert explained that he had heard pork smells similar to human flesh, so he figured that the bacon would distract the dogs, preventing them from detecting the bodies. His plan seemed well thought out, almost like he had studied how to evade detection. He even commented on his old car, joking that if it had been a newer model the police could easily track his movements, but since it wasn't, he felt like he had outsmarted them. And get this, Robert agreed to show the officers where he had hidden the bodies. So in the middle of the night they drove to Bragg Creek, and Robert led them to the exact spot where he had buried Jasmine and Aaliyah's. The bodies were wrapped in blue moving blankets, buried under dirt, sticks and mulch not far from the makeshift fire pit. The fact that Robert brought the officers to the scene was chilling, as it showed just how proud he was of his actions. Many killers return to the scene of their crimes or keep mementos, and Robert seemed to take pleasure in showing off what he had done. The information Robert provided was more than enough for the police to arrest him. Immediately the Calgary Police Department held a press conference soon after, but they didn't disclose all the details right away. DNA evidence confirmed the worst. The bodies found were those of Jasmine and her young daughter Aaliyah. Jasmine had suffered brutal blunt force trauma to her head, with the added horror of a bullet wound behind her left ear. Aaliyah too endured savage blows, one to each side of her head, another to her back, and a spinal injury that made the fall theory impossible. Both deaths were ruled homicides, giving the authorities the green light to pursue murder charges, no longer just manslaughter. On the 7th of May, Robert's fate took a darker turn as he was officially charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, while the prosecution briefly considered pushing for first-degree murder charges. They ultimately concluded they couldn't prove premeditation, but they were confident second-degree murder would be their focus, and they aimed for a solid conviction. As his trial unfolded in October of 2021, Robert's defense took an unexpected turn. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Jasmine, but insisted almost callously that he had nothing to do with Aaliyah's death. Robert's defense team painted a chilling picture of what they claimed happened on April 17. They argued that Robert had picked up Aaliyah from daycare and brought her home to an empty house. Jasmine was nowhere to be found. He and Aaliyah played together, watching her favorite show The Wiggles. At some point, she wandered upstairs toward the kitchen, but tragically she slipped and fell backward, hitting her head. Robert claimed she got up quickly, appearing fine, so they continued their evening, eating dinner and watching TV. Later, Robert put Aaliyah to bed, went outside to smoke a cigarette, and made himself a drink. Jasmine came home around 7 o'clock, and at about 9:00 she went upstairs to check on Aaliyah. What she found was every mother's nightmare. Her daughter wasn't breathing and was unresponsive in her bed. According to Robert, Jasmine immediately flew into a rage, accusing him of killing Aaliyah, but that accusation set Robert off in a fit of anger. He said he grabbed a hammer and struck Jasmine repeatedly until she collapsed. To make sure she was truly dead, he then retrieved a gun and shot her. The story only worsened from there. Robert, in a macabre attempt to cover his tracks, wrapped Jasmine's lifeless body in a blue moving blanket, then used a towel to clean up the blood. He tossed the towels away, made himself another drink, and went to bed. Over the next several days he buried their bodies and burned anything that might have tied him to the crime. However, the autopsy told a much darker story. The injuries to Aaliyah's head and spinal cord were far more severe than any fall could explain. The evidence was too clear this wasn't an accident. Additionally, medical examiners claimed that Aaliyah had injuries to her genital area, suggesting possible harm in that part. This revelation led prosecutors to believe that when Jasmine returned home on April 17, she caught Robert in the act. Fearing that Jasmine might expose what she had discovered, Robert reportedly killed her to silence her. In a panic, he then killed Aaliyah, fabricating the story about her accidental fall down the stairs to cover his tracks. Of this theory seemed to align with what Jasmine's family had said about Robert's behavior, how he doted on Aaliyah, picking her up, cooking for her, and spending time with her in a way that raised suspicions. Although many might argue that a good step-parent can show care for a child, Robert's excessive interest, especially in light of the medical examiner's findings, seemed more than just ordinary affection. What's particularly striking is that Robert never denied killing Aaliyah during his conversations with undercover cops. Instead, he framed it as an accident. Prosecutors argued that had Aaliyah's death been truly accidental, Robert would have been eager to make that clear, especially considering how horrific the idea of killing a child is. In court, they pointed out that Robert never once said that he didn't kill her. Instead, he stuck with the story he had told from the beginning. Robert himself took the stand as the sole witness for his defense, repeating the same account. Aaliyah had fallen down the stairs, hit her head, and died in her sleep. But his excuse didn't hold up, especially when it came to the claim that he couldn't call for help because he couldn't find his phone. In reality, Robert had his phone with him the entire time, plus authorities were able to track his text messages, including one sent to his mistress just before the killings. Despite these inconsistencies, Robert waived his right to a jury trial, allowing the judge to decide his fate. The judge found him guilty of second-degree murder in Aaliyah's death, stating that the injuries were not accidental and that Robert had intentionally caused harm. And the judge also pointed out that Robert's actions, drinking and smoking after the murders instead of seeking help for Aaliyah, showed a clear lack of remorse. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Jasmine's family was satisfied with the sentence, though they acknowledged that no amount of time would bring Jasmine and Aaliyah back. The family also found solace in knowing that their loved ones' legacies would live on through their charitable efforts. They raised $25,000 for the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter and started a memorial scholarship in Jasmine's name to help other women who have survived domestic violence. In 2022, Robert appealed his conviction, arguing that the medical examiner couldn't rule out an accidental fall causing Aaliyah's fatal injuries. However, the appeal was rejected, and on July 23, 2024, his conviction was upheld. As for Jasmine and Aaliyah's families, they continued to honor their memories by raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting those affected. But many people felt that the sentence wasn't enough, with only 20 years and the possibility of parole. Some believed it was too lenient given the brutal and calculated way. Story 2. I was shocked. I started crying. I mean, it stunned me. I didn't know how it could happen. I don't know why it would happen. That's exactly how 17-year-old Jeff reacted when he discovered that 4 members of his family were brutally murdered on the night of his prom. This case is one of those that will have you second-guessing everything. Seriously, everything from the cops to the detectives, the prosecution team, and even the judge. To this day, many people still can't believe he's guilty. And by the time you finish this video, you might just be left asking the same question that's haunted everyone who's followed this story: what really happened? Lakeville, Indiana, a tiny town with fewer than 900 people. Jeff and his family weren't ordinary folks in this town. They were well known and played a significant role in the community. But Jeff and his family didn't start their story there. Jeff, whose full name is Robert Jeffrey P., was born on December 10, 1971 in Florence, Kentucky, to his parents Robert and Eva P. As his name suggests, Jeff was named after his father. A few years later, Jeff became an older brother when the family welcomed a second child, a daughter named Jacques, in 1980. When Jeff was 9 years old, the P family packed their bags and moved to Cape Coral, Florida. The reason for the move was a new job opportunity for Bob, Jeff's father, who had secured a position in computer programming at Landmark Bank. Now, Jeff and Jacques were raised in a religious household where going to church was a non-negotiable part of life. Bob, their father, was deeply committed to his faith and strict when it came to discipline. Crying wasn't allowed, as Bob believed it was a sign of weakness, a lesson he carried over from his own upbringing. However, the kids found comfort in their mother Eva, who provided them with a space to show their emotions, but life took a heartbreaking turn in February 1985 when Eva passed away from skin cancer. She had refused treatment, and her health rapidly declined, eventually leaving her in a coma. For Jeff and Jacques, losing their mother was devastating, and their family's dynamic was forever changed. This was evident just a few months after Eva's death, when Bob met a 27-year-old woman named Dawn Huber. Dawn had also experienced loss, having recently lost her significant other. The two were introduced through Bob's cousin, Katie, who was also Dawn's best friend. Their connection was quick, and within 9 months of Eva's passing, Bob and Dawn married in a small church ceremony in Ohio. However, this union wasn't exactly a happy occasion for everyone. Jeff and Jacques weren't even invited to the wedding, although Dawn's 3 daughters, 5-year-old Jessica, 4-year-old Janelle, and 2-year-old Jolene, were present. By 1986, the newly blended family made a fresh start in the tiny town of Lakeville, Indiana. Bob believed he had been called to ministry and accepted a position at the Olive Branch United Brethren Church. This was no megachurch, it was a humble congregation of just 40 to 50 members. The job offered a modest salary of $1,300 a month, which when adjusted for inflation would be about $3,700 to $4,000 per month in today's money. What made the deal sweeter was the free housing, a parsonage provided by the church situated conveniently right across the street. After moving, Jeff began attending Lavallee Junior-Senior High School, where he quickly became well liked by his peers. He also got a part-time job at McDonald's, further cementing his place in the community. Around this time he started dating a girl named Darla, and from the outside it seemed like life was finally settling down for the Pellys in their new town. However, just like any true crime story, life is also a way of taking a shocking turn when you least expect it. A few years later, something unimaginable happened that would forever change the Pye family story. On Sunday, April 30th, 1989, Dave, a member of the Olive Branch United Brethren Church, was responsible for making sure everyone showed up for the service on time. At around 9:15 in the morning, he noticed something unusual. Pastor Bob and his family were nowhere to be found. Bob, who ran the church, was always there before 9. This was highly out of character for him. Around the same time, an 11-year-old girl named Stephanie, who was friends with the Pye children, went over to the family's parsonage. This was a regular Sunday routine for her, but when she got to the back door of the garage, she was surprised to find it locked. Thinking something was odd, she tried the sliding glass door at the back, but that was locked too. Confused, Stephanie ran back to the church. Thinking she had simply missed them, she told her father Henry about what happened, and together with Dave they started wondering if the Pye family might have just overslept. By 9:30, Dave asked a young church member to step in and lead the service. While he tried to figure out where Pastor Bob was, he walked over to the Pellys parsonage and knocked on both the front and back doors, but there was no answer. All the blinds were drawn and the curtains were shut tight, leaving Dave unable to see anything inside. Feeling uneasy, he returned to the church and sat in the back row, but something didn't sit right with him. Minutes later, he and another church member decided to try a spare key to gain access to the house. Unfortunately, the key didn't fit. Just then, Lydia Easter, another church member, saw them struggling and offered them another key, one belonging to her husband, a staff member of the church. Dave tried the back door first, but it didn't work. He then moved to the front door, and to his relief, the key turned, and what he saw in that hallway would haunt him forever. The first thing he noticed was Bob's eyelashes lying on the carpet. As he stepped closer to the glasses, he looked to his left and froze. There on the floor was Bob, face down in a pool of blood. Panic set in. Dave rushed to the back door, letting the other church members inside. He told them to call 911 immediately. As he continued to survey the house, he spotted the stairs leading down to the basement. He peered down and saw 2 small feet clad in white socks. His heart sank. He knew it was one of the children. The dim lighting made it hard to see, but the unmistakable feeling of dread overtook him. Soon paramedics arrived. Dave quickly told them not to touch anything, as he suspected a murder had taken place. They turned on the light, and the scene would soon reveal a chilling truth. The Sunday after prom Night in April 1989, parishioners with Lakeville's Olive Branch Church found their minister and his family dead on the floor of the church parsonage. Reverend Robert P. was found with 2 bullet holes in his body. His wife Dawn was found entwined with the bodies of her 2 young daughters, Janelle 8 and Jolene 6. This tragedy was truly horrific, and as you might recall, there were 7 members of the P family, so with 4 of them found dead, the search for the remaining 3 children was on. It turns out though that 3 of the children weren't even home that morning. Jessica, the 9-year-old daughter of Dawn, had spent the night at a friend's house when her friend's mother drove her back to the parsonage that morning. They arrived to see yellow caution tape surrounding their home. Jessica immediately sensed something was terribly wrong, and her worst fears were confirmed when she learned what had happened to her family. But there was still the question of where Pastor Bob's other 2 children were. Jacques, aged 14, was about an hour and a half away at Huntington College visiting friends from a church camp. The situation surrounding Jacques' return was strange. A bishop from their church came to pick her up, but he didn't tell her anything about the tragedy that had just unfolded at home. Jacques was completely blindsided when she arrived home and learned of the devastating news. Jeff, the 17-year-old son of Pastor Bob, was also nowhere to be found. Detectives later learned he had been at Six Flags Great America, a theme park in Gurnee, Illinois. They pieced this together from Jessica, who mentioned it during the investigation. Now tracking Jeff down wasn't as difficult as it seemed, though he and his girlfriend Darla, along with a group of friends, had spent the day at the park. While standing in line for a ride, Jeff started to feel something wasn't quite right. It was a nagging sensation, one that he couldn't explain, but he couldn't shake it. He turned to Darla and confided in her, saying he thought something bad had happened, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Darla tried to dismiss his concerns, but Jeff's uneasy feeling only grew stronger. Before long, the police arrived at Six Flags and they separated Jeff and Darla from their friends. They began to interview everyone about Jeff's whereabouts the night before, trying to piece together his movements. Jeff was interrogated right after this with his grandparents, and there's actually a clip of him being questioned. "We didn't get along real well. I mean, we talked high type thing, but we never really talked to each other or anything. I mean, I didn't hate her or anything, but we tolerated each other." "Which ones?" "All 3 of them." "What about them?" "Oh, I get along with the girls great. I just love the girls." "No, we had a real good day Saturday. We got along real well. Saturday we didn't argue at all." He said that I'd been doing a pretty good job of shaping up and everything. "No, I really don't. I don't know who would want to know. I didn't know. I didn't. Me and my father didn't get along. Sometimes I'd be really upset with him, but we always worked things out." As you can tell from the clip, the tension in the air was palpable right from the start. The police were cautious around Jeff, and their suspicion was undeniable. It was clear to them that something wasn't adding up, and they began to focus their attention on him. The reason for their suspicion, according to the investigators, Jeff's relationship with his family was anything but simple. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As it turns out, when Bob and Dawn married, Bob had hoped that Jeff and Jacques, his children from his first marriage, would accept Dawn as their new mother, but that was a lot to ask, especially since their real mother had passed away less than a year earlier. For Jeff and Jacques, moving on from their mother was impossible. They couldn't just forget her, and that resistance created a rift in the family that would only deepen over time. To make matters worse, Jeff and Jacques didn't agree with the way Dawn was raising her daughters. The differences in parenting styles caused friction at home, and Jeff in particular was growing more distant from his father and the new family dynamics. According to their neighbors, Jeff had become something of an outcast within his own family. He didn't fit in, and it seemed like he was always on the outside looking in. But that wasn't all. 6 weeks before the tragic events, Jeff found himself in serious trouble. He was arrested for stealing CDs and cash from a neighbor named John. The crime itself was bad enough, but the aftermath was even more telling. John chose not to press charges, but instead they worked out a deal. This, however, didn't sit well with Bob. His anger was palpable, and as a form of punishment, Bob decided that Jeff wouldn't be allowed to attend prom. That was a big deal for a 17-year-old, and it was a blow to Jeff's social life. Bob didn't stop there. He openly shared Jeff's behavior problems with others at church, further isolating Jeff from the rest of the community. It was clear that Bob was frustrated with his son, and this tension only seemed to escalate. To add insult to injury, Bob even took matters into his own hands by removing some of Jeff's belongings from his car, including his car keys. The car in question was a 1984 silver Ford Mustang, a flashy, attention-grabbing vehicle that was hard to miss. By taking the keys, Bob essentially grounded Jeff, restricting his freedom even more. With all these factors at play, the police's suspicion of Jeff only grew stronger. They couldn't help but wonder if his frustration and anger had led him to do something unforgivable, and after that tense interview they began to focus their attention entirely on him, trying to find any clue that would tie him to the crime. But here's where things start to get tricky. There are a lot of discrepancies and oddities in this case that really make you question whether Jeff was actually involved. Let's start with the first major contradiction. Jeff wasn't originally allowed to attend prom, a decision Bob had made as punishment for his previous transgressions, but then surprisingly Bob had a change of heart and allowed Jeff to go. According to both Jeff and his sister Jacques, Bob could be harsh when doing out punishments. However, once Bob had cooled down, he would often reduce the severity of his punishments, and this instance was no different. Jeff's prom night was not a typical rebellious teenager's outing though, and that's where things began to get murky. At the crime scene, detectives discovered some curious items among the usual evidence. Things like carpet fibers, walls, and bullet fragments. Was something far more intriguing. A set of keys was found in a trash barrel outside the house, but it wasn't just any set of keys. Attached to them was a heart-shaped locket, and inside the locket was a photo of a man and a woman. Strangely, the investigators paid little attention to this, and they didn't even photograph the item for evidence. What could this locket mean? Who were the people in the photo? These questions were left unanswered. Adding to the growing list of oddities, other peculiarities emerged as well. On Jeff's bed they discovered a photo book filled with pictures of his life from the first 7 years. At first this seemed like a normal childhood album, but as time went on it became an odd clue. It was as though Jeff had been looking back on his early memories, particularly when his mom was still alive and his dad wasn't remarried. Could this have stirred up intense emotions that led to the violence? The police also found a load of laundry in the house, freshly washed that same day, and it only contained Jeff's clothes. This raised suspicions. Was Jeff trying to cover up something? Some speculated that he might have been revisiting his memories when he lost control, perhaps in a fit of rage, and murdered his family before quickly cleaning up. But there was something much more puzzling that wasn't found at the crime scene. Despite the brutal killings, there was no sign of the weapon that caused all the destruction. There was number 20 gauge shotgun, no shell casings, and no indication of where the weapon had gone. The P family had indeed owned a Mossberg 520 gauge shotgun which Bob had purchased in December 1987. Bob traded a .44 caliber handgun and $90 to acquire the gun, which he had planned to give Jeff as a Christmas gift. But by the time the authorities arrived at the scene, the shotgun was missing. Even more strange was the fact that it wasn't included in the list of evidence, and no one could explain where it had gone. Keep this in mind, because this missing gun would become a key detail in the mystery later on. And to understand the timeline better, let's rewind to the day before the murders on April 29, 1989. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Jeff worked a morning shift at McDonald's, and later that day his father Bob stopped by a gun store owned by Steve Diller. Bob didn't buy anything, but he spent some time talking with the owner. Afterward he picked Jeff up from work and they headed home to the parsonage. It was well known that Bob had recently picked up a hobby, photography. On that particular day he had scheduled a photo session with several couples, a task he was excited about. Eyewitness accounts would later place Bob at the parsonage before the tragic events unfolded. The window of time in which the family was likely killed was incredibly short, only about 15 minutes between 5:10 and 5:25 in the evening. A couple, Kim and David, were some of the last people to see the family alive. They had just finished taking photos with Bob and were leaving the house around 5:00. Another man, Matt Miller, drove by the parsonage at 5:15. and noticed Jeff's Mustang still parked in the driveway. However, when Kim and David passed by again at 5:30, the scene had dramatically changed. Jeff's car was gone and the family was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, another couple, Crystal and her date, had a scheduled photo session with Bob and his daughters at Crystal's house, but when Bob and the girls didn't show up at the agreed time, Crystal grew concerned. She decided to go over to the parsonage herself. When she arrived with her date, they knocked on the doors but no one answered. All the cars were parked in the driveway except for Jeff's Mustang, which was missing. Based on these accounts, it seemed clear that Jeff's car was gone by 5:30 p.m., which would have been after the murders had occurred. However, some eyewitness accounts didn't quite match up. Kurt Schaefer, a friend of Jeff's, and his cousin Ken saw Jeff leave the parsonage between 4:45 and 5:00. Kurt even recognized the distinct sound of Jeff's Mustang. Lewis, another neighbor, also saw Bob around 5:00 talking to a man in a black pickup truck. Bob was holding a shovel, and although Lewis waved at him, he seemed distracted. Who is this man in the black truck? No one knew, but perhaps the most crucial sighting came from Dennis, a gas station clerk. Dennis was working at an Eakaco station just minutes from the parsonage at 5:17. In the evening, he saw Jeff pull in with his Mustang. Jeff was under the hood of his car wearing a black Hawaiian shirt and blue jeans. Dennis remembered the time clearly because his shift was supposed to end at 5, but his replacement was late at 5:20. Jeff entered the store and used the phone to call his girlfriend Darla. He told her his car was idling too high and that he was running late. After the call, Jeff returned outside to continue working on the car. By 5:37, Jeff left the gas station and Dennis clocked out for the day. From these accounts, if the P family was indeed murdered between 5:10 and 5:25 p.m., it seemed clear that Jeff had no involvement. Moving on, Jeff later went to his friend Lynette Greer's house around 5:45 p.m. A visit confirmed by his girlfriend Darla. The two, along with Lynette and her date, went to the Emporium restaurant at 6:15 p.m. to meet more friends at the restaurant. Everyone said Jeff appeared perfectly normal, chatting, laughing, and enjoying the evening like any teenager. Later that night, Jeff attended prom and afterward went bowling. Witnesses at both events described him as calm and collected, seemingly unaffected by the horrific events that had occurred just hours before. If he were indeed involved, he spent the night at a friend's house and went to Six Flags the next morning carrying on as though nothing had happened. The police questioned everyone who had been with him that day, but no evidence connected him to the murders. His whereabouts were accounted for and no clues tied him to the crime. As a result, the case went cold and attention shifted away from Jeff. Over the years, the surviving children, including Jeff, grew up. He and his girlfriend went off to college while his sisters went to live with their grandparents and in foster care. Unfortunately, Jeff's relationship didn't work out and he eventually moved back to Lakeville. However, his return to his hometown was anything but easy. Since the murders, most people still viewed him with suspicion, pointing fingers at him as the prime suspect. The constant whispers and judgment weighed heavily on him, and as a result, Jeff decided to leave Lakeville behind for a fresh start. Seeking a new beginning, Jeff relocated to Fort Myers, Florida, where he started working in the credit bureau business owned by a longtime family friend, Philip Hawley. The Hawley family welcomed him as one of their own, and Jeff eventually married Philip's niece, Kim. It seemed like life was moving forward for Jeff, and for a while things appeared to settle down. However, the shadow of the past was never far behind. Years after the tragic deaths of his family, Jeff and his sisters were each left inheritance money from their parents' estate. Jeff was set to inherit $48,000 while his sisters would receive $65,000 each, but there was a catch: they couldn't access the funds until they turned 23. Desperate for the money, Jeff became fixated on getting his hands on it sooner, and he came up with a plan. He told a story about having skin cancer and needing surgery to make it seem real. He even forged medical papers, but his plan didn't work. The names on the documents didn't match the hospital staff, and it became clear he was lying. The FBI, who had been investigating the P family case, got involved. They tracked Jeff down for trying to deceive them. In the end, Jeff was charged with wire fraud. He didn't go to prison but he was sentenced to probation. The charge was a lighter one but it still made his reputation even worse. After all the trouble with the fraud charges, Jeff shifted his focus to something else. Computers. He managed to land a job as an international consultant for the well-known company IBM. Things seemed to take a turn for the better. He and his wife Kim had a son and moved to Jade City, Florida. They bought a beautiful house that was worth around $500,000. For a while it seemed like Jeff was finally rebuilding his life. However, things weren't as perfect as they appeared on the surface. In 1997, Jeff and Kim filed for divorce, though they later reconciled and got back together. Despite all this, the shadow of the P family murders still followed Jeff wherever he went, leaving him with a tarnished reputation that wouldn't go away. By the year 2000, the county prosecutor in Lakeville had changed. A new prosecutor named Chris Toth took over. He was determined to reopen cold cases, hoping to bring justice to victims like the P family. He put together a fresh team of investigators and assigned Detective Craig Whitfield to take charge of the case. Craig's first step was to track down Jeff's two surviving sisters, Jack and Jessica. Jessica, the only surviving child of Don, who now goes by the name Jessie, had been disconnected from the rest of the family for years. She had spent a lot of time in foster care and struggled with substance abuse by the time Craig interviewed her. Jessie had two children of her own and she wasn't really in touch with her siblings anymore. During their conversation, Jessie revealed something shocking. She had once believed her father Bob was responsible for the murders, but as she got older she found out that Jeff was actually being looked at as the prime suspect. Jessie remembered an unsettling conversation she had with Jeff when she was just 15 years old. 6 years after the murders, Jeff invited her to visit him and his new wife in Florida, and while she was there he asked her, "Who do you think did it?" Jessie, still thinking it was their father, replied, "Your dad." To her surprise, Jeff simply said, "Okay." At the time, Jessie didn't think much of it, but looking back she realized that Jeff might have asked that question because he was worried she might suspect him. After that, Craig interviewed Jacques, but she came with a lawyer by her side, worried that her words might be twisted or misinterpreted. Jacques was becoming more convinced that Jeff was the only possible suspect. The detectives were desperate to find solid proof to link him to the murders, so they started focusing on the laundry found at the crime scene. According to Craig Whitfield, the lead investigator on the case, he explained that a dark and pink striped shirt, a pair of blue jeans and 2 white socks were found packed inside an Anna's Finer Foods bag. Inside one of the pockets of the jeans, the FBI discovered 34 coins and $1, which added up to a total of $1.50, along with a receipt from Anna's grocery store. Craig believed that the jeans being found in the washer was suspicious and could be a probable cause to arrest Jeff. He thought that Jeff had likely left the money and receipt in the jeans because he was distracted and in a rush to take them off, forgetting they were there. However, a pair of blue jeans was never found in the washing machine, only a shirt and socks. In fact, not a single detective or officer involved in the case ever said they personally handled a pair of jeans. Jeff was wearing blue jeans when he went to Lynette's house before prom, so it was strange that they weren't found. Another issue raised was that no officer ever went to Anna's grocery to confirm whether Jeff had been there. No one came forward to say they had personally seen him there. It seemed likely that the jeans were never washed and were not found in the washing machine with the shirt and socks. Instead, Jeff's clothes that were found in the back of his Mustang, including a Hawaiian shirt, may have been mixed with the other evidence. Craig then wrote up a probable cause statement for Jeff's arrest, and the newly elected prosecutor approved the warrant on August 10 of 2002. 13 years after Jeff's family was brutally taken from this world, he was arrested on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Craig, accompanied by a SWAT team, went to surround Jeff's house, but he wasn't home. Jeff, now 30 years old, was in Los Angeles. After returning from a work trip to Australia, while at the airport, customs detained him because a warrant for his arrest had been issued. Jeff was now going to fight a battle in court, and his apparent motive was that he wasn't allowed to go to prom. Jeff's sister Jacques and his wife Kim found a defense attorney named Alan Bound. Alan had never heard of the case before, but he agreed to take on Jeff's defense. His first move was to try to get Jeff bond, but this wasn't successful because Jeff was considered a flight risk from 2003 to 2006. There were multiple delays in the trial. Alan kept trying to get the case thrown out, arguing that Jeff's right to a speedy trial had been violated. Jeff was eventually released on bond for most of 2005. In 2006 it was finally time for the trial. The lead prosecutor, Frank Schaefer, argued that Jeff was responsible for the murders even though there was almost no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Alan, on the other hand, argued that the police investigation had been flawed and they had focused too much on Jeff without considering other possibilities. Both of Jeff's remaining siblings, Jacques and Jessie, took the stand and they had different things to say. Jessie testified that she had seen the 20-gauge shotgun hanging in her parents' bedroom before she left for her sleepover, but Jacques said that the shotgun had been removed the year before along with all other firearms in the house. Jeff had mentioned this during his police interrogation as well, explaining that their father Bob decided to get rid of the firearms in the house because he didn't think Jeff was safe around them. Bob had given the guns to a man named Thomas Kebb. Thomas had stored a bag containing the shotgun, a rifle and a pistol at his in-laws' house in their basement. The strange part was that investigators never spoke to Thomas or asked for the guns. Alan, the defense attorney, chose not to use Thomas as a witness because he believed that Jeff's mental state during that time might have influenced the jury's decision. On the other hand, the prosecution didn't want to call Thomas because they feared it would weaken their case against Jeff. Additionally, Jessie testified that her mom told her Jeff was going to Six Flags Great America, which Alan believed could raise doubts about Jeff's involvement as it seemed like he had permission to go to prom, so why would he kill his family? Additionally, remember Dave, the man who first discovered the crime scene. Initially he said the blood at the scene was still wet, implying the deaths had happened not long before, but when Dave testified in 2006 he switched his story, saying the blood was actually dry. There were also wet washcloths found nearby, and Alan, Jeff's lawyer, brought in an expert to show that washcloths would have been dry after about 12 hours. However, because the experiments were conducted in Arizona, the court didn't accept the results. Even more suspicious, no blood traces were found on Jeff's jeans, and Alan argued that Jeff wouldn't have had enough time to carry out the crime in under 15 minutes. After all, Jeff was just 17 years old at the time. Most teens wouldn't have been able to clean up a crime scene that quickly, especially since, according to everyone who knew him, Jeff didn't act strangely after those minutes. Another piece of strange evidence came from Bob's stomach, where they found popcorn kernels. Jacques, Jeff's biological sister, testified that Bob had a habit of eating popcorn every night between 7 and 8:00 p.m., usually after he put the girls to bed. In fact, a bowl of popcorn was found on Bob's desk, suggesting he had time to make and eat it before the crime took place. There were also two different types of shotgun shells found at the scene, plastic and paper, leading Alan to suggest that either two shooters or two different shotguns were involved. On top of that, the Mossberg 500 shotgun found in the P house could only hold 5 rounds, but 6 shots were fired, casting more doubt on Jeff being the sole perpetrator. Now, Jeff never took the stand in his defense as his lawyers believed it would be too risky. On July 22, 2006 he was convicted on all charges, and on October 17 he was sentenced to 160 years in prison. Some, like Jeff's stepsister Jessie, felt relieved by the conviction, but the story didn't end there. A new lawyer, Francis Watson, has been tirelessly working to prove that Jeff was wrongfully convicted. Watson has uncovered evidence that Jeff's original lawyer Alan didn't do his job properly during the trial. He believes the prosecution lied about the jeans, claiming they had been washed when they weren't, and that the lack of blood on Jeff supports his innocence. Watson also argues that Jeff's right to a speedy trial was violated, adding another layer to the case. A major new twist in the case involves Bob's connection to a man named Philip Hawley, who also had ties to Jeff when he left Lakeville. In fact, Philip may be the reason Bob and his family were tragically killed. Bob worked at Landmark Bank in Florida and had a close working relationship with Philip, who was Bob's supervisor. Philip was deeply involved in handling large financial transactions at the bank, and it turns out Bob discovered some serious financial fraud happening among his closest friends. This revelation left Bob terrified for his life. Pastor Michael Ross testified that Bob sought him out for advice about his fears, telling him he was worried for the safety of his family. Jacques Pie, Bob's daughter, also remembered how her father's paranoia grew. During this time things took a strange turn when a woman named Tony Beer, who worked at United Church Directories, came forward. She reported that Bob had confided in her, expressing fears that people were after him. Sadly, this crucial testimony was never shared in the trial because, incredibly, the recordings of her interview with investigators were mysteriously lost. Adding to the intrigue, a man named Eric Dawson, who was connected to the same bank in financial dealings, was murdered in a manner very similar to Bob's. Eric had become friends with Philip Hawley, and after his disappearance it was discovered that Philip had forged documents and engaged in various fraudulent activities, including misrepresenting financial transactions. Eric's body was found months after his disappearance, and authorities eventually uncovered a complex web of financial crimes tied to Philip and his family. Despite an extensive investigation, Philip was only convicted of forgery and theft, while his family members received little to no punishment. Even more suspicious was the fact that Philip Hawley was the beneficiary of a life insurance policy linked to a man named Harry Stewart, who was later exposed as a non-existent person. Bob P. had worked with Philip during this time, which raises serious questions about why Phil would have been the beneficiary of such a policy. This case is filled with many unanswered questions. Why were the guns never found? Why was Jeff not allowed to testify in his own defense? Could there have been multiple people involved in the crime? And why are there inconsistencies in the evidence, such as the claims about the washed jeans and missing shotguns? The new lawyer working on Jeff's case has uncovered significant flaws in the original investigation, suggesting that Jeff might have been wrongfully convicted in 2024. Despite all this new evidence and a push for a new trial, Jeff was denied for the fourth time. St. Joseph County Judge Stephanie Steele ruled that Jeff did not meet the burden of proof needed for a new trial. The judge has denied Jeff Pelly's petition for a retrial. P. was convicted of killing his father, stepmother, and two stepsisters in Lakeville in 1989 so he could attend crime-related activities. A 3-day hearing was held in March of 2022 to give Pelly's legal team a chance to present new evidence in the case. When you think about it, if Jeff really were the killer, he would have to be one seriously skilled assassin. Imagine the level of expertise required for a 17-year-old boy to take out 2 adults and 2 children, clean up, and still have time to act like nothing happened, all within 15 minutes. And to top it off, he went to prom that evening laughing and having fun with friends. The next morning he was back at the park seemingly unaffected. This case is incredibly wild and raises more questions than answers. Story 3: 11-year-old Kiana Davis, 9-year-old Kiara Phillips, 7-year-old Carrie O. McDonald, and 5-year-old Keen Welch all died when this 2-story duplex went up in flames and arson. A quiet town in Carroll County, Indiana, known as the Garden Sport of Indiana, was always peaceful until November 21, 2016. When a tragic fire claimed the lives of 4 young sisters. How did the fire start? Was it an accident or was it set intentionally? Today we'll uncover the details of this heartbreaking case. Galen Rose had just started a new job with higher pay and was excited. She dreamed of giving her daughters the best life she could. Her girls, Kiana Davis, Kiara Phillips, Carrie O. McDonald, and Keen Welch, were her world at 11, 9, 7, and 5. The girls were full of positive energy. Galen dreamed of a life of endless possibilities for her daughters, one filled with opportunities. She missed her childhood was boring, and she didn't want that for her girls. Her father, Tracy Rose, went to prison for drug crimes when she was only 12. She didn't have him around until 2011 when he came back into her life. Even so, this was not enough. Well, Tracy loved her and his grandchildren so much he moved to Florida and urged Galen to go with him. She was reluctant at first but had missed her father so much. After weeks of considering his offer, she followed her father to Florida with the girls. She believed Florida was a fresh start for her and her little girls. Galen and the girls lived with her father for 8 months until she secured a spacious apartment. She rented the 2-story duplex for $500 monthly. This was a Breath of fresh air for her and the girls. The duplex had a front porch on a tree street. They settled in so fast. The girls often played with each other outside. They were friendly to everyone and made new friends in the neighborhood. They played with the neighbor's dog since they didn't own one. The four sisters also loved to dance, play sports and enjoy family time. The sisters who lived in Florida loved to cheer. In this video, the eldest sister Kiana helps her 7-year-old sister Carol work on their routine before a competition. They were members of the Lafayette Diamonds cheer team. They had just competed in a cheerleading tournament the Saturday before the fire, and on Sunday Kiana had a basketball game. Kiana loved basketball and dedicated many hours to it weekly. Tracy predicted she would be a basketball star like Galen. He went with her to games and cheered from the crowd. Galen was super proud of her girls. She worked long hours in a gas station. She even took extra shifts to make ends meet. Galen was calm and cheerful like her daughters. She smiled behind the counter and spoke politely to customers. Her girls sometimes called her their coach because she supported them, especially during Tuesday cheer practices. Watching them perform was the highlight of her week. On the afternoon of November 21, 2016, Rose and her daughters headed to the grocery store. It was one of those exciting trips because the girls picked out their favorite snacks. When they got home it was already evening. Rose cooked dinner and after they ate she sent them off to bed around 10 p.m. The girls echoed goodnight as they snuggled under their blankets. Rose responded and was grateful for her little family. The exhausted mom of four headed to her room. A few minutes later there was pin drop silence with everyone fast asleep. No one could have guessed what would happen next. The Friday before the fire, Tracy prepared to leave town. He visited his granddaughters and asked them to help him pack for the trip. The girls, who called him Papa, didn't want him to leave. They asked him to stay a while with them. It was unusual that they asked him to cancel his trip, but then he didn't make much out of it. He left anyway. Hours later he woke up to a call from Galen. She said his granddaughters were dead. How did it happen? Galen was fast asleep when she heard screams from her daughter's bedroom. It was a few minutes past 3:00 a.m. She woke up and immediately jumped from the bed. The flames were spreading fast as the screams continued from their bedroom upstairs. She tried to get to them, but the intense heat wouldn't let her. Smoke filled her lungs as the flames pushed her back from the staircase. She couldn't breathe or talk. At that moment she realized rescuing them alone was impossible. She ran from the house to get help from neighbors. The first call to 911 came in at 3:30 a.m. While they waited, neighbors gathered around the house to help the four girls. Meanwhile their injured mother watched helplessly. Neighbors rushed around the house desperate to help, but it was too late. The screams grew fainter with each passing moment. Galen was later airlifted to a Kinatsi's burn center. She suffered burns over her body and smoke in her throat. Carroll County Sheriff's Deputy Drew Udar also suffered severe smoke inhalation. When he arrived he briefly spoke with Galen. He asked where the kids were and she pointed to their room upstairs. Yoder immediately asked the county to send medics. Coughing heavily, he tried to make his way up a narrow smoke-filled stairway. The girls shared a bedroom on the second floor. The climb was complicated and impossible. Galen desperately directed Udar from outside. She urged him to keep climbing until he reached the girls' bedroom. Yoder inched closer, but the smoke overpowered him. Seconds later he exited the building. Breathing heavily and groaning, he raced to the floor of fire department which was arriving. He yelled at them to get the fire equipment moving. Yoder was hopeful that the fire department would do its job. While the fire department inched closer, Deputy Yoder and Officer Dissinger wore air packs getting ready to enter the house. They crawled on hands and knees to the front door. Unfortunately the flames came towards the cops from the back of the house. Firefighters reached the officers and 3 of the girls and got them out. CPR began immediately on the girls, hoping to save them. The 4th girl was brought out of the house. Efforts to rescue her continued while firefighters battled with the flames inside. The medical team tried to save the girls' lives outside. Unfortunately all 4 sisters could not be revived. They died at the scene as the fire continued to rage through the home. Udar and Dissinger sustained injuries and were airlifted to the hospital. Neighbors were shocked at how fast the flames engulfed the building. Flora, a town that is barely larger than a square mile, was thrown in grief, suspicion and Fear. Everyone wondered if the fire was intentionally set. Rumors swirled around town and the investigation started. Immediately we're taking each one of those rooms and looking at those independently, taking a look at all possible causes. The Indiana State Fire Marshal initially ruled the fire as undetermined, however they determined that the fire started in the kitchen area. 2 months later they changed the cause of the fire to arson after they found accelerants throughout the home. I want publicity about this case because I want it to be solved. Was IP aware that release was going out on Saturday? We were not. Investigators declined to talk about the type of accelerants found. Days later the state police released a contradicting report, raising further questions. After further investigation, they discovered that accelerants were only found in one part of the house. This means that the fire started in one place. This conflicting information leaves doubts as to the real truth. A private investigator confirmed the fears of many. In an email sent to state police it read in part the press release statement about accelerants being discovered in several locations is absolutely not based on any evidence discovered at the scene during the investigation. And the investigator Dennis Randall was not performing a proper origin and cause investigation based on the current procedures of NFPA 921,206 edition. To opine that opinion to add insult to injury, the Indiana Fire Marshal's fire investigator assigned to the Floor House fire resigned. Investigator Dennis Randall did not give a reason for quitting, but this move was fishy. Before his resignation, Josh Ice was Randall's boss. Ayers was president of the Floor Town Council and Galen's landlord. The resignation is not good news for Galen and her family. They believed it would hamper the investigation. They have many questions left unanswered. Could Randall's resignation hurt the chances of locking up someone for arson? It would be difficult for a new investigator to take on the case with the same enthusiasm. Will the small town politics hinder justice? The answer is not yet clear, but if Galen's suspicions are right, it would be another devastating blow to the case. Although arrests are yet to be made, the police say they're doing their best to get justice for the girls. The Indiana State Police Superintendent said they're focused on finding the arsonist. Doug Carter insists that the fire was intentionally set and someone who knew the family committed it. Carter also revealed that detectives have traveled to Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, and California for investigation. He added that detectives are still speaking to anyone who visited the home before the fatal fire. It's been over 8 years since the incident and there's no justice. This leaves much to be desired, considering that the Delhi murders were given more attention. Recall that Abby Williams and Libby German were killed on February 13, 2017. Shockingly, the police swung into action and arrested the suspect. Richard Allen has since been arrested and sentenced to 130 years in prison. Ironically, the arson case is far from being solved. Police say it is unfair to compare both cases. They say very little is known about the arson case, but with the homicide they had over 80,000 tips. Is that the case? What if the police are hiding something? When journalists asked to speak with Deputy Yudar, the officer hospitalized after the fire, Carroll County Sheriff Toby Lazenby declined. Lazenby also refused an interview with Flora Fire Chief Todd Trent. When journalists reached out to the lead investigator, he declined comments, but then State Police Superintendent Doug Carter made a cryptic comment on the Flora investigation. He said, "There's a couple pieces that we need, and those that know what those pieces are know what I mean, so I'll leave it at that. Why are the police tight-lipped? Is there something they're not telling the public?" While Flora residents await the police, rumors have swirled around town. Galen's involvement in the fire is at the top of the list. Did the girl's mother deliberately set the house ablaze? Here are the shocking facts. On July 19, 2019, the Indiana State Police wrote to Galen Rose. The letter expressed their desire to discuss the fire. As if that's not enough, they offered her immunity over her alleged illegal drug activity. It is unclear what her alleged drug use has to do with the investigation. While Galen admits to occasionally smoking marijuana, the letter further asks to speak with her to get more information about whom she commonly associated with. Although this letter was dated 5 years ago, investigators have not named her a suspect. She maintains her innocence. The police later expressed frustration over Her lack of availability to speak to investigators. She spoke to them 3 weeks after the fire with nothing tangible to advance the case when journalists tried to clarify the offer for immunity. The Carroll County Prosecutor's office declined to comment. They would not speak to anyone until after the investigation. Investigators also have another reason to suspect Galen. According to documents submitted as part of the investigation, a policy was written on August 6, 2016 for the house the girls lived in. The policy had liability coverage for $392,882 and took effect on September 15 that year. A home appraisal dated September 10 was included in the documents. The home was appraised for $45,000. Policies are sometimes written based on a verbal conversation with the property owner. Subsequently, an insurer may physically look at the property. The timing of the policy and the fire raises serious red flags. Was this a case of insurance fraud? Was the policy created to cash in like a lottery ticket? As speculation continued, Galen added a twist to the case. On August 25, 2022, she filed a federal lawsuit against her landlord Josh I's, his business partner Troy Helderman, and their company Birch Tree Holdings. The suit exposed a web of alleged misconduct. It's been nearly 2 years since mother Galen Rose of Flora lost her 4 daughters in a house fire, and now she is suing her former landlord. Named in the case are landlord Josh, his business partner, and their company Birch Tree Holdings. Faith Alvarez, Galen's attorney, told the court that Indiana law requires functional smoke detectors to be installed outside each bedroom. The smoke detector was right by their door, right up the stairs. Right there it was. 1. There nothing on it. It was one in the kitchen. However, when Galen rented the apartment there weren't any earlier. She raised urgent concerns with her landlord about the faulty electrical outlets and the missing smoke detectors, but he did nothing to fix them. The complaint claims that firefighters found one smoke detector without batteries. The suit says Birch Tree Holdings and 2 landlords were responsible for the lack of working fire detectors. Galen hired Mike Virgin, a former ATF fire investigator, to solve the puzzle. He spent over 15 years as a certified investigator before starting his own company. Virgin visited the house 3 times in 6 months before releasing his report. He discovered one smoke detector with no battery in it. Determined to uncover the truth, Virgin ran through fire debris in the backyard but couldn't find additional smoke detectors. He paid extra attention to the kitchen connecting the back porch. He then examined the appliances in the kitchen. His findings were clear. It showed that an electric malfunction did not cause the fire. The most vital information in the fire investigation came from a witness. Adams was a neighbor and one of the first responders on the morning of the fire. He was there minutes before the police arrived. Told Virgin that he tried to reach the stairway to the bedroom where the 4 girls slept, but smoke drove him back. Before leaving the house he saw a 2-in-wide path of flame from the back porch to the kitchen. He described this view in detail. Ayers was the only person who saw the ribbon of fire. He helped Virgin determine it was a set fire. However, Virgin admitted that the goal of the fire was not to hurt the children. After several back and forth, both parties reached an agreement on September 6, 2023. Jonathan Bont, Josh Ayers' attorney, confirmed that a settlement was reached. However, the details of this agreement are confidential. Both parties also agreed to pull down the building at 103 East Columbia Street, Flora. They had no objection to demolishing the damaged property. The day after the fire, Flora residents gathered for a prayer vigil at the church across the street from the home. After prayers, dozens of people dropped roses at the site of the fire. Their cheer team was also at the event. Team members lit candles in purple glitter outside the home in Flora. They also brought stuffed animals, balloons, and posters to honor the sisters. Cheerleading coach Ally Sheets accompanied her students to the vigil. She recalled that the girls never stopped smiling. She couldn't remember a time when they weren't cheerful. All 4 girls were always helpful, joyous, and respectful. Jen Brost was at the vigil that night. She was a librarian at Carroll Elementary where the girls attended school. She still can't believe that they're gone. She described the incident as surreal. Jen said the library turned into a counseling center days after they died. Her daughter Liz Brost is a member of the Girl Scouts and Kiana's friend. She says she remembers Kana for her happy spirit and positive attitude. Flora residents and neighbors also shared in their grief. For instance, Fox, their next-door neighbor, had problems breathing after the fire. Her husband had to call off work and her brother fell sick. The 27-year-old woman who lives steps from the home was terrory as she wondered what Galen was going through. Fox watched as smoke left the house. She heard the girls and their mom screamed their lungs out. It was the most devastating thing she had heard. Fox and her husband rushed out of their apartment that night. They were confused at first but then realized it was smoke. Then suddenly flames engulfed the home. The couple felt powerless. Her brother considered running into the home to help but gave way to emergency personnel. Fox and her family cannot get over the tragic event that night. Cassandra Hammond was also affected by the incident. Her business is across the street from the fire outbreak. It remains a sad reminder of the girls went through that night. Cassandra hopes the police find out the truth and that the girls will get justice. Another Flora resident, Eve Gibson, buried her face in her hands and cried her heart out. Speaking about the investigation, she said people in town were speculating who might have set the fire. She says a family member could have done it. It's too small of a community, somebody knows. And we're just praying every day that they get caught. If I'm dead and gone, I hope they get them, but we're just going to keep praying for justice. Flora community fear that the killer is in their midst. What if he targets another home in Florone? The friendly community has commemorated the 6 girls with a bench engraved with their names and ages. Every year they gather to place flowers on the home's porch in remembrance. Galen says she has been robbed as a mother. She can no longer take care of her children. She still calls on the public to help get justice for her babies. That said, now here's how you can help. A $5,000 reward is being offered for any information in connection with the deadly fire. Authorities made a heartfelt plea to the community, urging them to provide crucial information that could bring suspects to book. They assured that callers would remain anonymous. Police are also offering a reward of up to $5,000 for information that leads to an arrest. We need people to be talking to people and people to be listening to other people and then reporting it appropriately. Citizens can donate to the reward fund by sending a check to the Indiana Department of Homeland Security to ensure this fund goes to the project. The memo line should read Florifear Reward. Galen Rose has since moved to California to heal, but that doesn't mean the girls are forgotten. Story 4. It was bad for Bill and Nancy to have to die the way they did, but for a 7-year-old girl to die that way, to be wrapped with plastic, to be wrapped with duct tape, to have a 60 pounds rock strapped to her body and thrown into a lake, there was no excuse. Killing an entire family is already a horrifying act, but to torture a child while her parents helplessly watched, that's pure evil beyond anything words can capture. This became the burning drive for the whole Pope County Sheriff's Office in Arkansas back in 1996. What started as an unthinkable, brutal crime would soon pull back the curtain on an even darker web of secrets, all tied to one terrifying thing: white supremacy. No doubt about it, this is one of the most disturbing and ruthless cases we've ever covered on this channel. And it leaves you with one huge question: how does a mind set this twisted spiral into such heartless violence? Now, before we try to answer that, let's take a closer look at the victims. The Mueller family. For starters, the Muellers weren't just any ordinary family. They were gun enthusiasts, a lifestyle that defined much of their world. The father, William Mueller, wasn't just a passionate collector, he was a federal firearms lessee, meaning he was a licensed gun dealer. He also worked as a self-employed electrician, and his life revolved around guns, selling them, buying them, and even using them. He was married to Nancy, and together they raised their 8-year-old daughter Sarah, their only child. They loved her with all their hearts, and she was the center of their world. The family lived in Tilly, Arkansas, a small, tight-knit community where William and Nancy homeschooled Sarah. Weekends were often spent at gun shows, a shared hobby that only brought them closer together as a family. Given this, it's no surprise that their home was packed to the brim with firearms, ammunition, and a hefty stash of cash. With all that valuable loot just sitting there, it made the perfect target for a robbery, and that's exactly what happened. In 1995, the Mueller home was broken into by a man named Kirby Coe, who shockingly was a family friend. He stole guns and cash, but Instead of letting the setback shake them, the Mueller family didn't miss a beat. The robbery didn't stop there. Passion for firearms or their business now keep this robbery in mind, because it's going to be crucial in the investigation that unfolds later. Fast forward to January of 1996. The Mueller family was out of the house, probably spending some quality relaxed time together, but little did they know, waiting in the shadows of their home were two monsters ready to strike. The moment they walked through the door, as soon as they entered, the Muellers were confronted by these two men. They were dressed like FBI agents, but don't be fooled, these guys weren't the real deal. They were imposters. Without wasting a second, they tied the family to chairs. And when William Mueller, who was 52 years old at that time, refused to cooperate, things took a terrifying turn. The intruders separated the family and they began to torture them while interrogating. They did everything in their power to force the Muellers to talk, but when the parents still didn't give in, they turned their attention to the 8-year-old Sarah. This is where it gets absolutely chilling. Sarah was interrogated about the family's fortune, about where they kept their money and valuables, and to make her talk, one of the men shocked her with an electric cattle prod. While this isn't enough to kill a person, the pain is excruciating, especially for a young child like Sarah. After the little girl gave them the information they were after, they found $50,000 in cash along with guns and ammunition. Now you might think they just grab what they came for and leave, but that's not how it went. The nightmare was far from over. The Muellers were then subdued with stun guns which knocked them unconscious. The intruders took their sweet time with this, almost like they were enjoying the slow, agonizing process, but it didn't stop there. The worst was yet to come. The two men suffocated them by placing sealed plastic bags over their heads. Imagine the horror of knowing your entire family is being tortured, helpless and unable to stop it. That's the reality the Muellers were facing in those final moments. Now, if you thought the Muellers were found dead right after that horrifying night, well, you'd be wrong. The truth is, 2 weeks passed before anyone realized something was horribly wrong. Nancy Mueller's mom, Erlene Branch, hadn't heard a word from her daughter in all that time. That was totally unlike Nancy. She always called after their trips, especially when they went to those gun shows, so Erlene couldn't shake that gut feeling something bad had happened. She reached out to the sheriff, sharing her growing concern. Sheriff Jay Winters knew the Muellers, even though they lived in a neighboring county, and he agreed to help, but when he spoke to people in the neighborhood, they didn't seem worried at all. Most people figured the Muellers had just taken off somewhere, maybe a quick trip or a break from everything, and hadn't bothered to check in. It almost felt like everyone thought they were just giving themselves some space and everything was fine. Then on February 11th, an entire month later, the case took a terrifying turn. A farmer just going about his day found the Muellers' Jeep. It was hidden, abandoned on the side of the highway, far from where it should have been. This discovery set the investigation into motion again. Inside the Jeep was Nancy Mueller's purse, and it still held her wallet and ID, but the trailer was empty, with no sign of the family anywhere. As days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the Muellers' disappearance became even more unsettling. No leads, no clues, just the eerie silence of their absence. Then 5 months later, a twist in the case came when an elderly couple decided to spend a day fishing in a bayou near Russellville. While waiting for a bite, the woman snagged her fishing line on something, and when she tried to free it, she quickly realized she had hooked a boot that still held the bone of a man's leg inside it. Horrified, she cut the line and rushed for help. This set off another search led by Sheriff Winters, who organized teams to scour the bayou with metal hooks and divers. By the end of the day, they had recovered parts of a body. The torso was weighed down by a rock and the head was wrapped in duct tape. From the moment investigators saw the body, they knew this wasn't some ordinary crime. It looked like an execution, deliberate, cold and calculated. The body was that of a small female, and at first investigators thought it could be the body of a 6-year-old girl who had been reported missing from a nearby county the year before, but when they examined the size and the clothing, it didn't match. That's when they started to wonder, could this be Sarah Miller? The next day, 2 more partial bodies were discovered. All 3 torsos were weighed down with rocks and their heads were wrapped in plastic bags secured tightly with duct tape. It was a chilling scene. Using dental records, DNA and clothing, the Authorities confirmed the identities of the bodies. It was William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah. What had started as a missing persons case had quickly turned into a brutal triple homicide investigation. When the coroner examined the bodies, they concluded that they'd probably been in the water since January 11, the last day anyone had seen them. But there was more to the story. The investigators found tiny specks of blue paint stuck to the tape. They sent the paint samples to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for testing, and it was confirmed that the paint matched the type used on General Motors vehicles. With this new lead, investigators pieced together that 2 people must have been involved. One drove the blue car with the bodies, while the other followed in the Mueller's Jeep. By the time the bodies were dumped in the water, the Muellers were likely already dead, suffocated by the plastic bags. The investigation soon turned back to the Muellers' belongings, since the family had vanished. Most of their valuables had been taken by relatives, but some items had been left behind, stored in their landlord's garage. Among the things found were a Colt .45 gun case with a serial number, but the gun was missing. They also found a family photo with some friends. The team entered the gun serial number into the National Crime Information Center database, and bingo, the gun had been traced to a man named Travis Brake, who had been arrested months earlier in Seattle, Washington, for carrying a concealed weapon. He admitted that he bought the handgun at a gun show and described 2 men he had bought it from. One of the men stood out to him. Investigators showed Brake the photo they found among the belongings of the Muellers, and Brake pointed to one of the men, Kirby Coe. If you remember, this was the same man who had robbed the Muellers a year prior, and this guy was no stranger to trouble. He had a long criminal history involving firearms and was heavily involved in the white supremacist movement. However, the investigators still needed solid evidence before they could make an arrest. Nearly a year after the Muellers' murder, investigators got a break in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. A trooper spotted a blue Chevy Suburban with suspicious bumper stickers parked in a handicapped spot. Inside, Sean Haynes and his pregnant girlfriend were found asleep. The trooper ran the serial numbers on 2 guns Haynes had in the vehicle and discovered one, a stolen AR-15 rifle, had belonged to the Muellers. Arrested and questioned, Haynes admitted he had traded another firearm for the rifle at a Washington motel 6 months earlier. The trader, Chevy Coe, Kirby Coe's eldest son. At this point, the investigators had 2 suspects. But before we dive deeper into the case, let's take a moment to understand the background of the Coe family. Trust me, knowing their story will shed light on why they did what they did. Now, the Coe family was nothing like the Muellers. Chevy Coe, 26 years old, grew up in a household where white supremacy wasn't just talked about, it was their way of life. Chevy wasn't your average troubled young man. His father's influence shaped everything, steering the family down a dark and hateful path. When Chevy was just a baby, the Coes packed their bags and left sunny Florida for the quiet hills of Madison County, North Carolina. Fast forward to the mid-80s, the Coes moved again, this time to Stevens County in Washington. Initially, Chevy seemed like a bright kid with potential. He was an honor student at Cauville Junior High School, but by 1988 his parents decided to homeschool him. Their reasoning: they wanted to provide more focused attention, but instead of fostering a healthy learning environment, they created a bubble of radical ideas. From a young age he was pushed into a life of crime, learning robbery, theft, and how to fight off the cops. As you can imagine, the Coe home was a breeding ground for hate and paranoia. Anti-government beliefs were their bread and butter, and Chevy soaked it all up. He wasn't just a kid with big dreams. His dreams were violent, dangerous, and fueled by white supremacy. By the time he was a young man, Chevy had one goal: to overthrow the U.S. government and create his own white supremacist utopia, something he called the Aryan People's Republic. This wasn't just a phase for Chevy. This twisted vision was everything, and his family were the foundation for his dangerous ideology. You could see this influence clearly in 1995 when Chevy took part in a violent kidnapping and robbery. In June of that year, he and a partner targeted Malcolm and Jill Frigtening, a Jewish couple who owned a store where Chevy had once worked. The Frigtenings were held at gunpoint, but this wasn't just a random crime. Chevy specifically went after them because of their ethnicity. This act was a clear reflection of the hate and violence he'd Been raised to embrace with everything going on. It was no surprise that both Kirby Coe and his son Chevy Coe had been on police radars for years. If Chevy was involved in all kinds of crimes, just imagine the trouble his father Kirby had been up to. But here's the kicker: despite the long history of criminal activity, both of them were nowhere to be found. No one could track them down, and they seemed to vanish into thin air. That is until February 15, 1977, when a state trooper in Ohio pulled over a blue Chevy Suburban. The car had been swerving, driving way too slowly, and just looked suspicious while passing by. The driver didn't even glance at the trooper, but the passenger gave him a nod. The officer thought nothing of it until he realized the passenger kept staring at him through the rear view mirror even after they passed him by. That was when the officer's instinct started kicking in. They ran the license plate and found that it had expired. To top it off, neither of them had valid driver's licenses. When the trooper asked the driver to get out of the vehicle, the guy complied but warned the officer not to touch him. Then things took a turn. One of the deputies called for a tow truck to impound the vehicle, and that's when the driver suddenly bolted back to the car. The officers chased after him, but as they tried to subdue him, the guy who was sitting in the passenger seat pulled out a handgun and started firing at the officers, creating enough chaos for Chevy to jump back into the Suburban and make a break for it. Asked the driver to step out of the car. The man told the officer he borrowed the truck from a friend. He then refused to a pat-down search. Listen as the officer attempts to search the man for weapons, any guns, knives, clubs, stuff like that on you, sir. I don't want you going and searching through all my stuff. I'm not searching through your stuff, sir. I'm going to put you in my car. That's just fine. Now, do you have any guns, knives, clubs and stuff like that on you? No. Very good. Listen, sir, I don't want no problems. I'm not going to give you any problems, sir. Apparently he did want problems. A few more minutes went by. Then the man ran back to his car in an attempt to get away. The passenger then opened fire on the police. As the passenger ran into the woods, the driver sped away. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Turns out the two men in that intense standoff were Chevy Coe and his brother Cheney Coe. When Chevy took off in the Suburban, Cheney, who was in the passenger seat, bolted into the nearby woods. The cops spent the entire day searching for him, but as you might expect, they couldn't catch him. Now, just like Chevy, Cheney was also deeply embedded in white supremacy, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to push his beliefs. Later that day, Chevy found himself involved in another shootout, this time in the parking lot of an electrical supply company. He exchanged gunfire with two Wilmington police officers, Officer Richard Rickwood and Sergeant Robert Bob Martin. During the chaos, an innocent bystander, 56-year-old Frank Marsden, was hit in the shoulder. The shootout was captured on the dash cameras of both the trooper and the sergeant, and it quickly became a major story. The footage was aired in 1997 on Fox's World's Scariest Police Shootouts and became a hit, showing up on other programs like Most Shocking and World's Most Amazing Videos. Meanwhile, the Coe brothers were on the run, traveling in secret with their families across multiple states in an RV. Investigators feared they'd stop at nothing to escape, and the police had to step up their efforts. They spread out images of the brothers, hoping someone would recognize them or the vehicle at Lake Hill Campground. Investigators discovered that the Coes had camped there in an RV. But they were 2 days too late. The RV had already left. Days turned into weeks, and sightings of the RV kept pouring in from across the country. They had been spotted in places like West Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and Montana, always just one step ahead of the law. In Indianapolis, the stolen van with Chevy's gas receipt was found, but there was no sign of Cheney. A few days later, the Coes' RV was found abandoned on a desolate stretch of road in Wyoming. When the police checked it out, they discovered a disturbing stash: guns, ammunition, fake FBI jackets, U.S. Marshals badges, and a box full of bomb-making materials. The ATF bomb squad was called in to inspect, and although they didn't find any live devices, the components made it clear the Coes were preparing for something far worse. Authorities were deeply concerned about the brothers' growing violence and what they might do next. As the search continued, it seemed like the Coes were always one step ahead. But then on June 16, 1997, investigators Received a tip Cheney Chevy's brother was ready to turn himself in. Cheney revealed where he and his brother had been hiding for the past few months, and authorities learned that after the shootouts in Ohio they had taken refuge on a remote ranch in southern Utah. The owners had given them room and board in exchange for help on the farm, but things had gone south quickly when Chevy's temper flared and his paranoia grew. Chevy even spoke about killing his wife Karina, who had Native American ancestry, and plotting to murder his own parents Kirby and Gloria to raise his younger brothers in his white supremacist vision. Then on June 12, Chevy's paranoia turned against his own brother after a violent argument. Cheney feared for his life and the safety of his family. He decided to flee with his loved ones in the middle of the night, driving nearly 1,000 miles back to Washington state, and that ended their long time running. Chevy was arrested on June 17, 1997. But that's not the most important part. The most interesting and important thing Cheney told law enforcement is that Chevy confessed to being involved in the murder of the Millers with another unnamed male. Additionally, around that time in June of 1997, Kirby the father of the brothers, was also arrested. Now, as you can imagine, the arrest of the father didn't exactly fit the narrative everyone was expecting. He wasn't involved with the Miller family's murder, nor was Cheney but just when the situation seemed to be unraveling, Gloria Chevy's mother stepped forward to law enforcement and dropped a bombshell. Gloria revealed that her son Chevy had confessed to her about the horrifying details of the Mueller family slaying. She went on to explain that the murders weren't just some spontaneous act, they were planned out for a whole year. The plan went way back to the first robbery of the Mueller family back in February of 1995, which had apparently set everything in motion. According to Gloria, the chain of events started when William Mueller, the patriarch of the Mueller family, confronted Kirby after suspecting him of being involved in the robbery. Apparently during this confrontation, William Mueller was incredibly disrespectful to Kirby, which did not sit well with Chevy. In fact, it seemed to be the moment that flipped a switch in Chevy's mind. He thought that William's disrespect was enough to give him the green light to go ahead and rob and kill the Muellers, but there was more to it than just a grudge over disrespect. According to law enforcement, Chevy's motivation wasn't just personal. He had found out that William Mueller was in possession of some serious weaponry, expensive firearms, high-end gear and ammunition, and that piqued Chevy's interest even more. Gloria didn't stop there. She named a second man involved in the murders, Daniel Lewis Lee. Lee wasn't a stranger to Chevy. He was someone Chevy knew through their involvement in white supremacy groups. Both Chevy and Lee were heavily invested in the idea of creating a whites-only nation, and they were bound by their shared ideology. Together they had planned to rob the Muellers, kill them, and cover up their tracks to avoid implicating themselves or Kirby in the crime. Gloria went on to explain that on January 11, 1996, the Mueller family had left for a gun show. While they were gone, Chevy and Lee dressed up as law enforcement officers and made their way to the Mueller home. When the Muellers returned, Chevy and Lee ambushed them, tying them up. But there was one part of the plan that didn't go as expected. According to Gloria, Lee was hesitant, especially when it came to killing Sarah Mueller, the Mueller family's daughter. Apparently Lee just couldn't bring himself to do it, so Chevy took matters into his own hands and killed Sarah himself. Fast forward to March of 1999, and Daniel Lewis Lee and Chevy stood trial for the triple murder. Both Cheney and Gloria testified against them, spilling the details of what had happened. The trial ended with a conviction. Chevy was sentenced to life in prison, while Daniel Lewis Lee was sentenced to death. Apparently Daniel Lewis Lee also had a deeply troubled upbringing, one that was marked by instability and violence from a young age. Lee faced significant challenges. He struggled with seizures and other neurological issues that often led him to be placed in mental health facilities. However, his time in these facilities was short-lived, as he was removed due to his violent behavior. His struggles were compounded by his inability to control his anger and his growing propensity for violence, which only seemed to escalate as he got older. By the time Lee was 17, his violent tendencies had already manifested in a chilling way. He was involved in the brutal murder of Joseph Wavro, which occurred during a robbery. It was the third murder in a string of violent crimes, but incredibly Lee managed to avoid a murder charge. Instead, he received only a suspended sentence for the robbery, a decision that seemed more lenient than it should have been given the severity of the crime. Unfortunately, this leniency did little to curb Lee's violent impulses. It only appeared to embolden him, allowing his thirst for violence to grow unchecked. It wasn't long before Lee crossed paths with Chevy Ko. The two met in 1995, and their shared hatred for the government and their twisted desire to establish a white supremacist stronghold brought them together. Now Lee tried to soften his image in court, claiming he had a good side and that he could change it. Felt a bit ridiculous, though his past was full of violent acts. His plea for mercy sounded more like a movie redemption arc than reality. The court didn't buy it. Lee's past was too ugly and no one believed he could really change. In the end, he was executed by lethal injection in 2020 for the first time in 17 years. A federal prison inmate was executed this morning. Daniel Lewis Lee received a lethal injection in Indiana after the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the execution to proceed. He was convicted of murdering 3 members of an Arkansas family back in 1996, including an 8-year-old girl. Lee told witnesses this morning, though, that he didn't do it. The High Court, with conservative justices in the majority, voted 5-4 overnight to reverse the lower court rulings. Those courts had been concerned with what they called an unconstitutional risk of pain when it comes to lethal injection. Despite being the mastermind behind the brutal murders of the Mueller family, Chevy Ko managed to escape the death penalty, while Daniel Lewis Lee, who had a less direct role, was sentenced to death. This didn't seem to make sense. How could the guy who planned and carried out the whole thing get a lighter sentence than his partner in crime? But what made things even crazier was that Chevy was involved in another huge crime, the Oklahoma City bombing. After Chevy was arrested, his brother Cheney claimed Chevy knew about the bombing before it happened. Apparently, Chevy was seen with Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, at a motel and spoken months before the bombing. The manager of that motel even said that Chevy had been excited about the bombing when the news hit, and had even hinted that something big was going to happen on April 19. Yet when the FBI looked into it, they couldn't find any proof that McVeigh had ever been in Spokane or that Chevy had any direct involvement in the bombing. Chevy denied everything, but the rumors just added to the mystery. It was clear that Chevy had ties to violent extremist groups, and yet he still got off easy compared to Lee. At the end, Cheney Keogh received a 24-year sentence for attempted murder and weapons possession due to his role in an Ohio shootout, while their father Kirby Ko was sentenced to 44 months after pleading guilty to federal racketeering charges. Later, Cheney's sentence was reduced to 11 years and he was released from prison in 2008. But Cheney's trouble with the law didn't end there. On October 14, 2013, he and Kirby were arrested by federal officials in Arizona after an ATF raid uncovered a large marijuana growing operation and an arsenal of weapons at an off-grid compound. Authorities seized 17 firearms, nearly 17,000 rounds of ammunition, 15 pounds of marijuana, and various pieces of body armor. Both Cheney and Kirby pleaded guilty to being felons in possession of firearms and ammunition. In 2014, Cheney was sentenced to 41 months in prison, while Kirby received a 10-year sentence. Cheney was released in September 2016 and Kirby followed in January 2022. As for Chevy, he spent much of his time at the United States Penitentiary Florence ADX in Colorado, under the Federal Bureau of Prisons Register number 213,009. He was later transferred to several different prisons, including United States Penitentiary Florence High and United States Penitentiary McCreary in Kentucky. By 2022, Chevy Ko was being held at the United States Penitentiary Terre, and one can only hope that he's suffering there more than his victims did. Story 5. In 2004, in the sunny city of Miami, a family's seemingly perfect life was shattered when a son's troubled past came back to haunt his parents in the most devastating way. This is the story of the Sutton family murder. Life was picture perfect for John and Susan Sutton. The couple adopted their first child, Christopher Sutton, in the late 1970s and welcomed their second child, Melissa. 7 years later, the tight-knit family of 4 lived in a luxurious home in Coral Gables, Florida. This upscale neighborhood near Miami is full of life and dreams. John was an attorney of high reputation. He was known for his mastery of the law and success in most high-profile cases he managed. He was licensed to practice law in the state. Since 1972, John's personality was unmatched. As for Susan Sutton, she was his loving wife and manager. Susan was a head nurse of surgical intensive care. We did a lot of traveling together through the Caribbean. I had a couple of different boats and would take them to the Bahamas and scuba dive and fish. She was his backbone in the office and the home. The Sutton family shared a love for education and community living. Both parents implemented discipline in their kids from an early age. Like every seemingly perfect family, there were challenges. Melissa was calm and obedient. She loved her home and did everything to protect it. She was everything a parent wanted. However, her brother was different. Christopher was a black sheep of the Sutton family, a role he seemed to have repented of. His parents believed he had left his troubled past behind. Unknown to them, he plotted evil. Beyond his newfound character were darker intentions. These intentions would later shatter the Sutton family. On August 22, 2004, John and Susan hosted a party in their home on Arjuna Drive off Granada Boulevard. This area was once known as the Devil's Den. Susan had just turned 57 and Jay's firm Sutton Law Group won 3 lucrative cases. The couple's son Christopher, his fiancée Juliet Driscoll, and Jay's law partner Teddy Monto dropped by for the gathering. After the party, Christopher and Juliet left for the cinema while Teddy headed home tired from the evening's event. John and Susan retired to their separate bedrooms. Although married, the couple didn't share the same bedroom. John was notorious for his loud snores and Susan couldn't handle them. She endured it for years before drawing the line. After saying their goodbyes, they went to bed, but then this night would change their lives forever. In a dramatic twist, a gunman sneaked into their house at about 10:30 p.m. This stranger parked his car down the trean streets of Coral Gables. As he walked into the house, he was dressed in black to suit the event. The dog barely barked as he walked in through the back sliding door. He knew the door was never locked, so it was easy. This intruder had a 9mm Glock pistol. He was on a mission to kill John and Susan Sutton. Upon getting to Susan's room, shots rang out. He fired 6 shots at Susan, who was on the phone in the master bedroom. Before John realized it, the assailant barged into his room, shooting him in the torso and face. Despite his head injuries, John managed to call 911. He groaned in pain as he requested for an ambulance. Meanwhile, the sudden attacker vanished into the night. Moments later, police swarmed the neighborhood from every direction. Medics drove the almost dying lawyer to a local trauma care center while confirming Susan's death. By this time, John was in a pool of his own blood. He lost so much blood that medics thought he would die. As police tried to wrap their heads around the incident, they noticed something was off. First, Susan's jewelry and John's wallet with cash were untouched. The person who did it was on a mission. He didn't want to mess with it again. One of the guests that night miraculously arrived at the scene. Teddy arrived right in time of the crime. He told the police that he was on the phone with Susan when he heard shots, so he raced to her house. Why was he on the phone with her at that time? Did Teddy want the couple dead? These questions prompted the police to name him the first suspect. Interrogations began the day after the shooting. Besides working at Jay's law firm, Teddy was a marksman. He was a competitive shooter and had been shooting earlier that day. This revelation raised eyebrows. In a bid to piece things together, Detective Cordero sent Teddy's gun for testing. While this was ongoing, she had a list of questions for the suspect. She felt he was hiding something about a secret relationship with Susan. Why else was he on the phone with her that night? After failing a polygraph test, Teddy confessed to having an affair with Susan. However, he had no motive to hurt her or her husband. Teddy's gun didn't match the murder weapon and police cleared him of the crime. Detectives confirmed he wasn't in the Suttons' home during the shooting. Who would want the Suttons dead? As a successful lawyer, John had a fair share of enemies. He occasionally received death threats, most of which he dismissed. Police checked the records, scrutinizing every name, but they all had alibis. However, there was one more person they needed to check. A woman had stormed John's firm days before the attack. She was angry over a settlement issue and threatened to wreak havoc. The woman had a boat that may have helped her escape through the waterway that night, but when police dug deeper they found no link between the woman and the shooting. Surveillance cameras showed the boat never left the marina where it was docked. If not her, then who? The police were back to square one as they examined little details. They stumbled on Christopher's records. On the surface he was a grieving son and devastated by the tragedy, but as detectives dug deeper they uncovered details of his past life. Layer by layer his past began to unfold. Christopher got into lots of trouble as a teenager. He struggled with conduct defiant disorder, a condition that led to frequent defiance and a lack of impulse control, making him difficult to parent. He was in and out of multiple schools. His parents wanted the best for him, but this teenager never understood. Upon dropping him off at a new school, he would sneak out through the back door into the street. He skipped classes and was not interested in learning. While in high school he and some other kids broke into a teacher's house and spray painted it. He was later arrested and sued. Christopher was mean. He wanted to draw tattoos, do body piercings and abuse drugs. Even though his parents hated that, he got extremely angry and destroyed things if he didn't get his way. At 16 he already had a rifle. Years ago he pointed it at Susan and Melissa. He threatened to shoot but changed his mind. They would later discover that the rifle was unloaded. Even so, he was a bitter pill to swallow. Christopher developed so much hate for his parents that he planned to kill them for the inheritance. One day Susan was cleaning his room and found a note. On that note he expressed his desire to kill his parents. When she confronted him about it, he told a joke. Susan didn't take it lightly. She was scared for herself, her husband and her daughter. She knew she had to act fast. They thought of getting a restraining order against him, but this was not enough. They wanted him out of the house. By all means, what better way to get rid of a headstrong teenager than to send him to Paradise Cove, a disciplined boarding school in Samoa. Christopher was shipped to this strange city for a behavior modification program for troubled boys. His parents believed this was the answer to his problems. Christopher was only 17 when he arrived. Punishments were severe and every rule counted in Paradise Cove. As someone used to breaking rules, Christopher spent hours in the isolation box. Offenders were sometimes bound with rope and dragged to the mountains where they were hogtied and left in the open sky. Paradise Cove was a brutal cage that stripped people of their humanity. After 1 year in Paradise Cove, Christopher sent a video message to his parents. The tearful kid expressed disappointment in his parents. He believed they sent him there to get him out of their presence. He explained how toxic the environment was and pleaded to be taken home. He didn't want to be there. John and Susan traveled to Samoa to see things for themselves again. Christopher tried to convince them, but they didn't believe him. Stories of it being torture were, I think, greatly exaggerated. He wanted to come back, I believe, to Miami and play. It was then that the teenager became determined to leave. He swore to leave the premises on his 18th birthday, but his father got a court order to keep him there for another year. Christopher was angry. He hated his parents for doing that to him. His relationship with his parents became bumpy after he left Paradise Cove. After piecing these details together, investigators thought that Christopher knew something about the fatal shooting. Was this a revenge act against his parents for his time at Paradise Cove? The case was gradually coming to a close. Christopher's interrogation was straightforward. On the night of the shooting, he and Juliet left for the movie theater. He showed detectives the tickets and surveillance cameras captured him leaving before midnight, but as they watched, something caught Detective Cordero's eye. Christopher was fixated on his cell phone. On his way out, phone records showed that he called the same number 331 times. Weeks before the shooting, he was constantly on the phone with Garrett Kopp, his childhood friend and smoking partner. Months after the horrific events of August 22, 2004, police have arrested Garrett Kopp for the murder of Susan Sutton and the attempted murder of John Sutton. Garrett was arrested less than 24 hours after the shooting for an unrelated event. He assaulted someone with a gun in another part of Miami and was apprehended. Detectives reached out to Garrett's arresting officer requesting the gun used for the assault. The officer obliged and they took it for testing. Shockingly, it matched the rifle used in the Sutton shooting. Garrett Kopp was immediately invited for questioning. The tense interrogation lasted for 6 hours. Garrett didn't reveal much at first, but with pressure from officers he Spilled the beans. Did he formulate this plan, or was it a combined effort between two of you? He did. What plan did he tell you? What did he want you to do? Go in the back door, walk in and shoot. He planned to go into the house and shoot the couple. In exchange he'll get $100,000 from the $500,000 in insurance money, and if he dared tell anyone about it, Christopher threatened to kill Garrett and his son. Garrett narrated how Christopher was desperate to execute his parents. He even got him the gun used in the operation and directed his actions. That night Christopher deliberately left the sliding door on the back patio unlocked and described his parents' room to the assailant. Getting into the family house was easy since Christopher had it all planned. Susan was under her blanket when he fired 6 times. The police arrested Garrett, but their focus remained on Christopher. Determined to find a connection, they turned to someone who knew him well. It was none other than his girlfriend Juliet. Officers invited her for questioning. Her confidence showed that she had nothing to hide. Juliet said she knew nothing about the crime. Although in a relationship with him, she didn't know about his plan. Over the 13-hour questioning, she maintained her innocence. She loved John and Susan like her parents and wouldn't hurt them. John gave her a job at his law firm and supported her financially, while Susan taught her hands-on skills like makeup and home management. Juliet became teary to convince them, but the officers were unmoved. They threatened her with arrest if she didn't speak the truth. At this point, Juliet knew she had to save herself. She revealed the deep-seated hatred her boyfriend nursed for his parents since they sent him to Samoa. He believed he would have been better if he hadn't gone there. He wanted them to pay for what they did to him. He was willing to retaliate even if it took a decade. Officers already knew about his life in Samoa but only wanted confirmation. Meanwhile, John woke up in intensive care with a massive injury that caused him to lose his sight. Melissa said her father was unrecognizable when she first saw him. It was a miracle that he survived. After his discharge from the hospital, John moved in with Christopher. Within those few days, his son tried to take over his bank account. He was shocked when he heard his son masterminded the shooting. Detectives called him early that morning, urging him not to let anybody in the house until they came. It made sense that Christopher wanted to get back at his parents. When officers arrived, they broke the news to him. Despite his health condition, he helped the police with information to solve his wife's murder. When news about Christopher's warrant got out, he was on the run for almost 2 weeks. He was eventually arrested, tried and sentenced. As the trial progresses, a clearer picture of who Chris Sutton is begins to emerge. The prosecution team will parade a string of witnesses on the stand to clearly illustrate the defendant's deep-seated anger and resentment that led to an obsession with revenge. The much-awaited trial started on July 7, 2010. As proceedings began, John Sutton sat far from his son. Prosecutor Kathleen Hogg told the jury how Christopher hired a hitman to slay his parents. The plan was to shoot his parents and get paid when the defendant got his insurance money. They went into detail on the true situation of his life. Christopher did nothing but sell drugs. When he returned from Samoa, he had no source of livelihood but depended on his parents to survive. Garrett took the stand to share his side of the story. Mr. Cop, did you shoot to kill Susan Sutton? Yes. And did you succeed in killing Susan Sutton? Yes. With what type of a weapon? Handgun. Did you shoot to kill John Sutton? Yes. Did you succeed in killing John Sutton? No. He recounted all that happened that night, how he walked into the house, shot both parents and walked out unnoticed. He and Christopher had planned the crime for months. His friend gave him $50 to buy black clothes for the crime at Walmart. Once again, he admitted that Christopher hired him to do the job, while Christopher's defense insisted that Garrett was lying. Defense lawyer Bruce Fleer claimed that the police forced Garrett to testify in exchange for a 30-year plea deal. He said that the hitman was threatened with an electric chair to make a false confession. Christopher told the jury that his friend wanted to escape the death penalty by all means, even if it meant a false confession. Prosecutors still stood their ground on the true situation of things. It was not the first time Christopher tried to execute this plan. They invited Jose Payan, a convicted murderer, to the stand to share his side. Payan met Christopher in 1999. At the time, Christopher was desperate to exact revenge on his parents. He asked Payan if he knew any hitman that would kill his Parents Pion thought he was joking, but Chris reiterated that his parents were worth $500,000 and had life insurance. It was a juicy deal, but Pion backed out, reacting to the statement. Christopher called Pion a liar. Prosecutors further proved their case by showing the jury a text Christopher sent to his girlfriend Juliet. It read, "We're going to be better off after they're gone." As if like a dream, Christopher dropped his head and shed tears. He worried that the police were setting him up. He believed Juliet would never say that about him. Sadly, he was wrong, because she was next to take the stand. Juliet told the jury about her boyfriend's perception of his mother. He called her a __ at the slightest provocation and disliked her for not giving him everything he deserved. She recalled how angry he was about his time in Samoa and how the trauma never left him, whether they needed to pay for taking those from his life again. Christopher's attorney countered the claims. He believed she was also threatened with the death penalty. Juliet ended by saying she never knew he would try to kill his parents. She believed it was all bluff. By now, John was convinced that his son was behind the shooting. He took the stand to nail him this last time. John described his son's insatiable desire for money for someone who didn't have a job. He needed so much to fuel his lifestyle. When John was discharged, Christopher wanted to control his finances. He noticed something was fishy and kept certain details away from him. Unknown to him, he was saving himself from his killer son. Although John was convinced about his son's actions, he still couldn't believe it. He told the world at the hearing that he no longer loved his son. He officially distanced himself from Christopher and is now known as Melissa's father. Despite the mountain of evidence pointing to Christopher, he had to prove his innocence to the jury. It was the moment he had been waiting for. Christopher called his childhood friend an insatiable drug fiend. He claimed that Garrett broke into his home to steal marijuana. Earlier that day, Garrett asked him for drugs, but he refused. However, his friend knew where he hid those drugs. Garrett knew the house so well because he visited often. Christopher testified that the drugs were hidden in the closet of his old bedroom. It was the same room Susan occupied until the shooting. He claimed that the marijuana was worth $7,000. When Garrett broke into his home that night, he was shocked to see Susan in the room. Worse still, she was awake and recognized him. He was scared and shot her. The same fear prompted him to shoot John before fleeing the scene. Christopher insisted he was innocent and had no reason to kill his parents. In fact, he had healed from the torture in Samoa. In a shocking twist, he told the jury that Paradise Cove wasn't bad after all. He benefited so much from it. When asked about the maltreatment there, he broke down in tears. In contradiction to his earlier claims, his reaction proved that he hadn't healed from his experiences there. In her closing statement, prosecutor Kathleen ended by calling Christopher a greedy, lazy, and entitled man. She urged the jury to look through the details and do the needful. After a day and a half of deliberations, Christopher Patrick Sutton was found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. On the other hand, Garrett pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. His father, Mitchell Kopp, was disappointed in his son. He'll spend nearly half his life behind bars over a silly decision. After Christopher's sentencing, John returned to his law firm. While working on regaining his sight, he considered optic nerve regeneration at Skapensai Research Institute in Massachusetts. He has now implanted a device around the back of his eye. While waiting for a permanent solution, he still practices law thanks to an aide. John memorizes his briefs and wins his cases. Like in the old times, he reportedly has a girlfriend who loves him unconditionally. John has still not forgiven Christopher for what he did to his family. He's now in his 70s and continues to practice law. His life is taking shape with each passing day. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at Mr. Nightcared True Crime Stories. Remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.